Okay, so just a minute. Okay, now I'm going to turn it off. See, that's what was happening to me.
Speaker, and then I talk, and then on again, it'll go right back on. So as long as you
Oh, don't you worry about that. Don't. No. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, everybody.
Welcome back.
So, there are no public questions. With that, I'll call the meeting to order. Looking to the agenda, there's a couple of changes. We're going to remove item G4, which is appointment of council rep to the Canmore Mountain Arts Foundation. That's just going off the agenda. And no, that's the only change. Are there any other changes? Can you hear me now? So I'll move the agenda be approved as amended. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. We have no delegations. Looking to the minutes of March 20th, there's a few changes to the minutes that Ms. Hyde will put on the overhead. So there's two amendments. There was some mix-up in the minutes themselves. They didn't reflect what actually happened. So if everybody wants to read those two amendments, do you want to speak to them, Ms. Hyde?
So motion 49 in 2018 is recorded twice just because there were some amendments before it was voted on. And then the first bullet that we noted underneath 4928 was also the motion that Councillor Sanford made after the motion for second reading. So at 50A, they're the same motion. So it was an error that was deleted at, it was an error that it was recorded at 49-2018. And then the second one was really just a typo. So the letters, this is what the actual motion was. instead of you seeing it in your
Yeah.
report, it says better than the MNECB 1997. Those words were never in there, so it was just an error in recording. That's the actual motion.
Thank you.
Except for that, yeah, also 49-2018.
Okay, are there any other errors or amendments or questions about these amendments that council has? Seeing none, I'll move the minutes be approved as amended. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Looking then to item D1, the reconsideration of motion 29-2018. Councillor Seeley, this is your motion. I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Your Worship. At the March 6th council meeting, when Y2Y applied for property tax exemption under Section 364 of the MGA, a deadline was discussed. The deadline was referencing copter application that Y2Y did not qualify under became part of a debate and a deciding factor. Section 364 was lost in the discussion, and only this pertinent information needed to be considered. Section 364 of the MGA does not have an imposed deadline for an application, and council has granted tax exemptions for other nonprofits, the U of S, Cause Canada, and the Scope Society. I believe Y2Y is similar to these nonprofit organizations, and with clarified information, the bylaw merits reconsideration. With that, I'm now putting the motion to reconsider on the table for debate. Would you like me to read the motion?
Sure.
Okay. The council agreed to reconsider their decision on March 6, 2017, motion 29-2018, to give first reading to bylaw 2018-05, nonprofit organization 2018 property tax exemption.
Thank you, Councillor. And just so councillors understand this, it's not that often we have a motion to reconsider. The motion itself to reconsider has to be carried by a two-third vote, so 5 out of 7. And if it's successful, then we'll literally just move on to that discussion of that motion. I'll speak briefly to your motion to reconsider, Councillor, although I wasn't at that meeting. I was following it. And certainly the conversation and the discussion during the vote seemed to be largely revolving around the Section 362. And as has been made clear, it's actually the exemption is being asked to be considered under Section 364. So if in fact councillors voted with their thinking process being influenced by 362 and the missed deadline and all, I would suggest it's reasonable to at least reconsider the motion and have a debate based on the allowance of that's given to council in Section 364. Is there other discussion to Councillor Seeley's motion? Seeing none, call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried unanimously. In which case then we will move on to item D2, which actually has two motions, but the first is the reconsideration of motion.
Your Worship, I think some of us misunderstood what we were voting for. So we were voting for a motion
To reconsider?
to reconsider. And I was not, sorry, that was not how my vote was going actually.
We can redo the vote.
Can we do a
We'll give you since you've been traveling for a day.
I appreciate that.
And I've been back for several days, so
Yes.
I'm more in the... Okay, so then on Councillor Seeley's motion to reconsider the first reading of Bylaw 2018-05, Is there discussion on the motion to reconsider?
No, I was quite
Okay,
comfortable.
I'll just call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried with Councillor McCallum in opposition. Good.
Thank you.
You bet. Moving on to item D2 then. As I was saying, there's two motions that council will consider under item D2, the first of which is Bylaw 2018-05. And then once that motion has been voted on, there will be a second motion, as you've seen in the agenda, around directing admin to draft a policy for future council decision-making regarding the same issue. So I'll ask Ms. Van Kaimpima to take the podium and speak briefly to the report.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of council. Welcome back. So briefly, I did a presentation on March the 6th, so I won't bore you with all of the same details again. But it does look kind of familiar because I started with that previous presentation. So this time there's two, sorry. All the mice? That'll work for now. Right, so this evening we have the two recommendations as presented in your package. So speaking to the first one, this graphic is also in the package that was handed out to council. So this is the legislation. So we get a non-profit application, comes in. So the first thing we do is look to see if they qualify under 362, which is the copter rules, and the ones that relate specifically to nonprofits is a whole bunch of numbers and letters, 362(1)N 3B, and that has a requirement of a September 30th deadline for sending in your application, and then all the supporting documents have to be in by November the 30th. So we take a look at that to see if they qualify. If they qualify under 362, they automatically get the exemption, and then they're exempt from all the taxes. However, there's that but in the second box on the far right-hand side. Council under 362 sub 2 through 4, council can make taxable any entity that is exempt to any extent they wish. However, they have to do that by bylaw. You have to notify the parties ahead of time when you're going to be deciding on that bylaw, and it takes effect 1 year after third reading. So those are the provisions. So you can tax somebody who is exempt under 362. So if they don't qualify under 362, so backtrack, application, we go down to the bottom green box, they don't qualify. So where does that leave them? They can say, I would still like to apply for an exemption. They would have to do so by coming to council under section 364. There's no deadlines that apply to 364. And then council can choose, but they have to do so by bylaw to make them exempt to any extent that you feel is appropriate in the situation. So the three choices for that green box are, you can totally give them all exemption from all taxes, you can give them a partial exemption, or you can say, no, you're not getting your exemption for anything at all. If they decide not to apply under 364, that means that there is no further exemptions and they would be expected to pay the taxes in full. So that's that decision tree, and that kind of quickly walks you through the legislation that's applicable. One other thing to remember is, and I did mention this on March the 6th, yes, there's new legislation under the Municipal Government Act, but the supplementary enactment to that is the copter regulation. And yes, they've proposed amended regulations that would change the playing field. However, that is not in force, so we must go by the current copter rules, which are the ones from 1998. And in there is the requirement that the benevolent and charitable purposes for which the nonprofit operates has to be for the benefit of the general public in the municipality in which the property is located. That requirement is removed next year, but not this year. And we don't have a choice about following it or not.
Were you finished?
I have other stuff, but I can wait. I can answer your question now.
You mentioned that one of the prerequisites under the MGA is the applicant has to be notified when we would be considering their request, and you've notified them that this was happening this evening?
Yeah, so we did, but there isn't a requirement to notify them under giving them an exemption. There's only a requirement to notify them if you're going to tax them. However,
I misunderstood. I thought we had to notify them that we are going to discuss the application in council today.
there isn't a legislated requirement. However, out of courtesy, I did notify them.
Great, thank you.
All right, so just a quick reminder of some of the background information. So there, we have as a total about 600 properties in the town of Canmore that are exempt. By far and large, most of them are our own land, so we wouldn't tax ourselves. There are 8 nonprofit organizations that have been granted tax exempt status, 5 of them under Copter, under 362, and 3 of them under Section 364. So the other 3 are the University of Saskatchewan, Cause Canada, and the Scope Society. Council granted, first of all, Cause Canada and Scope Society applied under 362. They didn't qualify. We came to council and they granted the exemption for everything except PAH and seniors requisition by council decision under 364. The other one, University of Saskatchewan, did not apply under Copter. They just came as a delegation to council and asked if they could be given exempt. So that was also under 364. So what are the financial implications of that? Gives you what the total would be for the whole property, reminding you that this portion of the whole property is 5%, so it would be 5% of the total of the property, and those are the numbers that break down. If you're interested in what is seniors and PAH added together, it's $511.90. That's what it would have been last year. We don't have the numbers for 18 yet, and that's why I'm providing the 17 numbers. So the first recommendation is about first, second, and third reading about the bylaw, and that bylaw is in your package. And then the second item I can speak to now, and then we can talk about the whole thing after. Tax exempt policy. So at March 6th meeting, I did mention in my presentation that due to the changes of the regulations and being able to sort of set some parameters around what would be required if an entity came and asked for exempt status, it would give administration an opportunity, if somebody does get an agreement under 362, what would be some of the parameters and requirements that we would have of them. It would also provide guidance to council if there was an application under section 364, or if there was an application, they were exempt, what would be some of the parameters where council would want administration to bring it back for consideration of taxing an exempt organization. So just a reminder, you can still only grant exemptions and by bylaw. So we would still have to come to council. If you put together a policy, a tax policy, it wouldn't be giving administration carte blanche to exempt a bunch of people without council input unless it's under the Copter regulations. So council would still have the opportunity to interject. And you can make sure that we then, the policy, the purpose behind the policy would to provide guidance, and so that it would also guide future councils when you're making a decision as a way to have a framework in which you can discuss and consider. And so that's the second recommendation. is to direct us to put together something for council. And that concludes my presentation, and I'd welcome any questions that you have.
Thanks very much. Are there questions from members of council at this time? On either, Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Ms. Van Kampima. I know we've seen this presentation before, but there's a lot of moving parts to this one.
Yes.
And there's things that are from the past, and there's things that are from the future. But one of the statements that was in the report says that the education tax will be recalculated by the province if this property is exempt.
Well, not for this year. It would for
next
19.
year.
They're always a year behind.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that doesn't mean, because from the chart that you showed us, the exemption includes that education tax, or a portion of it, right? The 5%?
Yes.
Which is $3,313. But that doesn't mean that they're going to redistribute that education tax throughout the rest of the taxpayers in that.
They will for this year.
This year,
if you were
right.
to exempt,
But they're asking this for next year, aren't they?
they're asking it for this year.
Oh, for this year, okay.
Yes.
All right, see that, this is very confusing.
I know it is. So what happens? So
Yeah.
if you're interested, what happens is the assessor puts together all of the numbers based on the condition of the end of last year, sends the numbers off to the province, and the province uses that assessment data to then divvy up how much across the province each town needs to pay for education taxes. So at the time that that information was sent to the province, Y2Y is not exempt, it's taxable. So that was added into the calculation. They don't redo that calculation until they get the next year's assessment data. So it won't be until January of next year that the province gets to learn, if council gives them the exemption, that they're exempt. And then that would be factored into how much the town of Canmore would have to pay in education taxes. So because they only make that change once a year and not when council makes a change, then we're still charged the education taxes as if Y2Y was taxable. And then I go in and I say, okay, non-residential properties all have to pay this much in education taxes, and then I divvy it up based on what council's decisions are up to that point. So if you were going to exempt Y2Y from education taxes this evening, then when I come to you with the tax rate, that means we'd pay the same total education taxes, but we'd have one less taxpayer paying that. So everybody's would go up slightly for this year.
Okay, and that's not what I'm understanding from the report, which says if an exemption were granted, the related assessed value would be excluded from the equalized assessment used by the province to calculate education taxes payable.
On a go-forward basis, yes.
Okay, but I was understanding this was for the 2018 tax year.
Yeah, and no, it's already been decided by the
Okay.
province.
But then by the time the MGA changes come into effect, the copter regulations will be changed, and none of this will be particularly relevant then.
That's correct.
Okay, so there's all these overlaps that are
Yes.
that are a bit confusing.
Yes, I agree.
And one of the things that was, I went back and looked at the previous applications, and everybody applied using that copter form, the assessment form. And once they were refused under copter, then it went to 364. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Then it could be considered under another MGA.
Yeah, or they could have just come in the first place and said under 364, which is what University of Saskatchewan had asked. And we said, well, we need the particulars in order to go ahead. So we had given them that form to fill in.
So we're using the application more for a process to initiate the process, because we don't have another application that we use.
The University of Saskatchewan was the first time anyone had come and asked for an exemption outside of the copter. So in the absence of ever having done that before, in order to gather the information, we had used that form. However, Cause Canada and Scope Society did apply as part of the normal process under 362 and filled out the form as a normal process. We just had University of Saskatchewan fill out the same form because we needed that same information.
Okay, so I think that's where it's confusing to us, is that we're using a form that is for the purpose of initiating the, kicking off the process of asking for the tax exemption. but then it's not necessarily relevant under the act that we're considering it.
But it is, because you need the same information under 364 as you do under 362. It's just a matter of how you analyze it.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions for Ms. Van Kaimpima? Or seeing none? Thanks very much for your presentation. So with that, now I will move that Council give first reading to Bylaw 2018-05, Nonprofit Organization 2018 Property Tax Amendment Exemption. Councillor McCallum.
I have an amendment for that, Your Worship. And it's the same one every time.
I anticipated that. I would have been disappointed had you not.
And the amendment is just to add on that except for the taxes paid for PH and seniors requisition, as everyone in our community benefits from that of affordable housing for seniors and for families and individuals, and Y2Y is no exception.
Yes, I fully expected that amendment. Are there questions for Councillor McCallum on the amending motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Back then to the main motion as amended. Now I'll speak to the motion. I'm inclined to support the first reading. Each one of these organizations, nonprofits that have come forward and asked for an exemption have presented a different scenario or a different relationship with the town, and Y2Y is no different. It's different from the others. Scope was different from Cause, and University of Saskatchewan was different from those two. So each time we're obliged to consider the application really on the merits of that organization. And when I think about Y2Y in our community, because that really should be one of the yardsticks, is what do they bring to our community. I've been involved with or quite familiar with Y2Y and its staff since they first opened here and close to 25 years ago. In fact, their first office, they rented a space from me above my pottery in the old Pigs building. And I've continued to be friends with various directors. That was Bart Robinson the first time, Rob, Carson Hoyer, now Dr. Hilty. So I have a fairly fluid understanding of Y2Y and what they've been doing in not only internationally, but here within the Bow Valley. And I really feel they bring a strong and well-informed voice to many community conversations around conservation issues. That's their mandate. They're recognized as being a leading mountain conservation agency well, at least in North America. And they've certainly stepped up and taken on a number of activities that benefit this community, some of which haven't gone anywhere, admittedly. I'm thinking of the Y2Y's interest in possibility of a conservation easement trust. And quite recently, Y2Y has one of their chief staff, one of the main staff sits as a volunteer on the technical working group for the Human Wildlife Conflict Roundtable on the technical working group. And the input received from Y2Y in that forum is well valued. So I see that the work Y2Y, although it tends to be often their work is focused on a larger playing field than simply the Bow Valley, and they're involved with activity and initiatives across Western Canada and across Western U.S. I really do feel that they bring good value to the town of Canmore as community residents, and I would consider supporting the organization through property tax exemption as amended by Councillor McCallum. I think that's a reasonable compromise. So, barring the debate, that's my intent is to support the motion. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. The motion to reconsider asks us to look differently at the issue. And I know when we had our previous debate on this, there was a lot of emphasis put on the timing of the request. I went back and looked at a few of the other copter requests that were made, and most of them were filed within the copter deadline. But the copter deadline was November 30th at the time. So the copter deadline has changed since, well, on that previous form that Cause Canada filed, it was November 30th. So that's what, I went back and looked at the information to review it. And so the deadline that we were looking at this time was quite different than previous. And it was my understanding that if something was turned down under copter, then it could be reconsidered under something else, if it was eligible in some other way. But in fact, from the information that we have since then received or understood, I mean, we received it, but it just wasn't that clear because there was so much information. 364 is a standalone situation, so people could apply at any particular time. But the copter form was used, and so I think that's something that we should look at in terms of how we evaluate these processes. So I would certainly reconsider it given the varied information that we've had on this subject, and looking back at some of the other processes that we used, I guess it was a common practice for people to use the copter form or the application, and I just assumed that it was a flow-through kind of thing, and apparently it isn't. So I will be happy to reconsider this.
We're already on the motion. We've passed the motion to reconsider. So this is
sorry.
No
I would be happy to support the motion.
The motion to grant the exemption. Right. Thank you. Ms. DeSoto, you had your mic lit up. Did you have something?
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify because I know that date of November 30th came up, and Ms. Van Kaimpima addressed that in her presentation, but you may have missed it. The copter process requires that an initial application be submitted by September 30th, but that all of the supplemental information in support of that application be submitted by November 30th. So that's where the two dates come from. But the copter deadline has not changed from the previous applications.
And not to put too fine a point on it, 362 and copter is irrelevant to this discussion because the application is under 364. There are other councillors that would like to speak to the motion that's on the table. Long pause. Seeing none. Oh, Councillor Seeley.
Well, I'll support this for much of the same reasons that I've already spoken to. I think this is similar to other organizations that we've previously exempted under 364. I'm open to hearing from my colleagues and shifting, but right now I'm certainly supporting, and I do appreciate the work that Y2Y does in our community. I think it's valuable in our community and beyond. So right now I'm leaning to support this.
Councillor, are there discussion from members of council on the motion to give first reading to the bylaw? Councillor Comfort.
I believe that I also will support it because of the muddiness of the information initial submission from administration, but I'm looking forward, a little off topic, to the suggestions from Ms. Van Kaimpima going forward on a bylaw or a policy to address the future ones. From what I understand, we're going to lose our discretion as a municipality to grant exemptions. They will become, under the new regulations proposed by the province, more or less automatic. And that troubles me a little bit, because I can think of non-profit groups that I might not be so disposed to support by providing exemption from taxes on behalf of the entire population. So I'm interested to see what happens there. And but in the meanwhile, I will support this.
So just want to make sure we're all clear. The motion is council give first reading to bylaw 2018-05, nonprofit organization 2018 property tax exemption.
Yep.
Is there further discussion in it from members of council? Councillor Hillstead.
I feel inclined to also support this. I was very hung up on them missing the date, but since that is now basically irrelevant, that was my main issue in the past. So with that said, I think I will be supporting this motion.
Are there the members of council want to weigh in on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried with Councillor McCallum in opposition. I'll then move the council give second reading to bylaw 2018-05, nonprofit organization 2018 property tax exemption. Discussion on that motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried with Councillor McCallum in opposition. I'll seek leave from council to go to third reading of the bylaw. Those in favor? Opposed? So we can't go to third reading? Oh, sorry, I thought we were at third reading. I'm not going to take that. Okay. Phew. Still jet lagged. Okay, we'll do that again. I'll move the council go to third reading of the bylaw. All in favor? Opposed? And then I'll move the council give third reading to bylaw 2018-05, nonprofit organization 2018 property tax exemption. Discussion? See none, call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried with Councillor McCallum in opposition. And what time did you get in, just out of curiosity? 1:30 this morning. Oh, nice. Well, if you nod off, we'll let you sleep for a while. Moving on then to the next motion, which is that I'll move the council direct administration to draft a policy to guide future council decision-making regarding property tax exemption. The recommended or the suggestion was a policy or bylaw. Is there I think a policy is better, but is there a preference, admin?
I believe the wording the way it is pending the regulations as to what the requirements are. If they require it to be by bylaw, this way that direction leaves that option open.
So you intentionally want to leave it open-ended?
Yes.
Fine. Then I'll move the council direct administration to draft a policy and or bylaw to guide future council decision-making regarding property tax exemption. Is there discussion on that motion? Councillor McCallum?
Thank you. I'm inclined to support this, but I guess the MGA provides council with the ability to decide each and every time as to whether they want to provide property tax relief. And I want to, within whatever, it is my hope that with whatever comes forward, we'll continue to give council the opportunity to exercise what little power we have as a council.
Yeah, for sure. But with a council policy or bylaw in place, then it does help council in these odd places that we end up in. So a nonprofit that's active in the community asks for a property tax exemption, and every time it's the same conversation. Oh, gee, do they bring value to the community? Mm-hmm. Or, why should I do that, or why shouldn't I? So I think there is value for council to have a policy and a bylaw if required.
But But I guess I'm worried if there's a policy or a bylaw, then we will be required to follow it each and every time. And I want to make sure
Yeah,
that,
fair enough.
as a counselor, I have the ability to exercise, again, what little power we have as a council.
Fair comment, and whenever something is ready for council, then we'll be able to beat it up and
Of course.
make sure it
And
works.
I just wanted to add that as a sidebar.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right, is there further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried unanimously. Moving on then, item F1, the Offsite Levy Bylaw 2018-06. Mr. Rao.
Your Worship and members of Council, I'm here to request that Council give first, second, and third reading to Offsite Levy Bylaw 2018-06. A bit of background on the 2018 update. Administration began the review and update of the Offsite Levy model in January of 2018. The Offsite Levy model and bylaw was last updated in 2017, and the model and bylaw will continue to be updated annually going forward. The components of the 2018 Offsite Levy update included three major components. One was the update of the Offsite Levy model itself. Two was reviewing those updates with relevant administration within Town of Canmore, as well as members of BODA and the MD of Bighorn. And finally, updating the Offsite Levy bylaw according to the model updates and the discussions that we had with the MD and with BODA. A bit more information on updating the model itself. We incorporated updated project costs based on the town's current capital budgets and actual completed project costs. This was only for projects, we only revise projects which have either updated project costs or known and actual completed costs. We also updated the dwelling units in the model based on input from planning and development. A bit more information on reviewing the updates to the model. So we did, upon updating the model itself, we ran that model by the builder of the model, the developer of the model, and he confirmed that the inputs were appropriate and the outputs were appropriate. We then reviewed those updates again with Town of Canmore admin, the relevant parties, BODA and the MD. BODA has since provided a letter of support. The MD has not provided a letter of support, but they're aware of the updates and the fact that we're requesting this decision from Council tonight. Third and final component was amending the bylaw itself. So the updates this year included updating the levy rates that we pulled out of the model, the updated model. We added a clause, it's clause 8.4, mentioning that the town will consider extending credit for existing commercial development. And we updated Schedule 2, which identifies the remaining offsite levies to be collected. So these components result in, or are the genesis of the changes to the offsite levy rates. If you look at the three rightmost columns, it indicates the rates this year. So you can see the change from 2017 to 2018, there's been an overall reduction. The reduction in these rates is a result of receiving significant offsite levy payments in 2017, as well as payments for dwelling units that had not been previously anticipated in the model for Northview and Hawks Bend. And that concludes my presentation. Whew, that was a quick one.
That was short and sweet.
Please let me know if you have questions.
And hey, when do costs ever go down for people, huh? Councilor McCallum, did you have a question?
Of course I do. I love the office. Thank you for your presentation. So I wondered if that was one of the reasons. That was actually going to be my first question as to the substantial reduction in the levy. How, I know going forward, we're perhaps looking at a different way of, not a different way, but calculating the levy differently, the computer model, stuff like that. At what point will we be looking at inserting fire and recreation inputs into the offsite levy, or will that end up being a separate bylaw?
Yeah, so we actually considered that this year because the MGA, the changes to the MGA occurred
Pretty quick.
They occurred as of October 2017, those particular changes. We did consider changing both the content of the bylaw itself in terms of text, as well as considered having whether we would have to revise the model itself. Fortunately, this year we didn't have a fire hall or a recreation center to include in the model, but going forward, I think in advance of getting to that situation where we need to include a fire hall or rec center, we would revise the bylaw text and deal with the model in advance of that situation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then my next question is, when we move forward by looking at a new levy model, I don't want to say new because I don't think the calculations, the outputs might be different, but just the overall look of it might be a little bit different. How will we begin to consider infill development in our community and how that will affect our offsite levy model going forward? So the 2 apartment buildings are examples of developments that have changed what people will pay per door. And we know that currently our suites policy does not include secondary or accessory suites as part of the levy.
Right.
But as we continue to look at infill development moving forward, how will that be addressed within the levy model?
Yeah, I guess part of that will fall out of the functionality of the models that the potential models that we look at using. I know that in the past, the town had looked at models from specific providers that weren't even able to factor in dwelling units. It was based on hectares only. So we're going to kind of have to play that one by ear until we see what's available in terms of those models and how they can accommodate our needs in terms of accounting for dwelling units and infill and that type of thing.
And in terms of communities in Canada that also believe that growth should pay for growth and have an offsite levy bylaw, which communities would you say have the oldest history of an offsite levy?
I can't answer that question.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
I
Sorry.
wasn't sure if that.
Yeah.
Mr. Fark, you had a comment?
So just to supplement Mr. Rao's answer to the previous question, the offsite levy model currently does incorporate some consideration for infill development. And we have an ability, for example, there's a credit component for infill development where if you are replacing a single family home with a fourplex, for example, you get credit for a single unit. But in addition to that, we are actually planning a comprehensive review of the offsite levy model. So that has not been done since we first implemented it more than 10 years ago, and where we will review all the assumptions, including unit counts, on a per neighborhood basis. And that work is planned. We'll probably come to council with a request for budget to fund that review as part of the 2019 budget process, and it's planned to be incorporated in the 2019 update.
Thank you, Mr. Fark. Thank you, Mr. Rao. Your worship, thank you.
Just on that note, that answers one of my questions. I suppose I was in page 1 of the report under discussion. It notes that the number of dwelling units, accommodation units, commercial hectares, et cetera, are reviewed annually by planning and development and may be revised, et cetera. And above that, in the executive summary, it notes that, of course, the discussion with Board and the MDA was agreed that an in-depth review of the current quantities, blah, blah, blah. So I think you were speaking to that. I was trying to understand what the difference was between the annual review and an annual or an in-depth review.
Yeah, so on an annual basis, we adjust the dwelling unit numbers based on planning and development's level of certainty around certain developments in the town. Those revisions are based on a baseline of assumptions. So those assumptions that we have made about the dwelling units that are going to be made in the specific zones, year to year they've been revised slightly, but the overall big assumptions around what does 850 units in this specific zone mean now compared to 5 years ago when that number was initially put in the model. It's sort of the difference between a minor tweak to the assumptions versus an overall zooming out in perspective and looking at that entire zone and the potential for actual that amount of development in that zone.
So is it as simple as just going out and counting every unit, or is there?
It'll fall out of consultation with BOTA, not so much the MD, and it'll be a more rigorous review of those numbers by planning and development by and large.
So it's really the number that we're trying to zone in on?
Yeah.
Not other parameters, but the actual exact count of units?
Yes, the assumptions around the values, yeah.
Okay. Did you have something?
So what I would add is that planning takes an inherently conservative approach to unit calculations on the offsite levy model. And that's a philosophy that we've discussed with BOTA a number of times, and they understand the rationale behind. The reason for that is you want to be conservative because if you under-collect now, then the last units are on the hook for the full cost of whatever is remaining, and it becomes prohibitive to develop later on. However, there has been some discussion about the accuracy of the calculations or the projections about what will actually get built out. We do have a new area structure plan that will probably be considered for the Three Sisters lands, for example. There has been some recent infill development. So it has been determined that it is an appropriate time to do a comprehensive review of all of the assumptions, especially once we have a bit more planning certainty around some of the developments that are expected to come forward.
You've noted that there'll be resource demand for that?
There certainly will, yes.
And is that going to come this year?
So the request for it will come as part of the budget process that we do this year with the expectation of implementation in 2019.
Right, okay, so it'll be part of the 2019 budget request.
That's right, yes.
Thank you. In the executive summary, you note, Mr. Rao, that the current version of the offsite levy bylaw was updated in 2017, and that would be then bylaw 2017-22, which is being repealed with the new bylaw?
Correct.
And on the second page of your report, right near the top, you note that the 2018 updates to the model have been reviewed and confirmed as accurate by the model's developer. Just curious who the model's developer is?
The model's developer is a previous employee of the town of Canmore that we hire as a consultant on an annual basis for this purpose to review the inputs and outputs of the model. It's Mr. DeLeo.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I wondered if it was Mr. DeLeo.
Yeah.
Great. And not that it's relevant, I was just curious. And it's interesting and reassuring to note that in the Schedule 2, all of the projects that you've added in, half dozen projects at the end, albeit not costed out, but these are projects that some of them we talked about for a long time, like the pedestrian bridge and whatnot, so at least they're now on this offsite levy rate sheet to be costed out. That's good news.
Yeah, and we introduced them this year largely to spur discussion with BOTA and kind of bring them to the forefront of as being potential projects for the future. Ultimately, it was decided not to include them this year, but...
Sure, but just the fact they're now on the offsite levy model is positive step. Then the last question I have is around there's some variance or discrepancy between the red line model version of the bylaw and the clean model, which isn't that relevant, I suppose, because we'll be asked to support the clean version. But in the red line model, for instance, 8.3, there's two 8.3s in the red line, and the second 8.3 was changed to 8.4. And in the red line, there were two separate sections, 9.3 and 9.4, that in the clean model were combined into one section, 9.3. I guess I'm just confirming that the changes that we see in the clean model are, that's the intended.
That's correct, yeah. There were some technical issues with my accessing senior management folders at the time, so there was some miscommunication about which should go and which should stay. But the clean version is the correct version. Apologies.
Just didn't want to lose that in the mix and have it turn out that the red line version was actually what you'd intended. Great. Are there other questions from council at this time for Mr. Rao? Seeing none, thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
And for the work. I know there's a lot of work involved in this.
Thanks.
And you have to meet with Boda and...
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Ron, I didn't see you there. So with that, I'll move the council give first reading to Offsite Levy Bylaw 2018-06. I'll be happy to support the bylaw myself. It's the bylaw comes forward every year with some revisions. It's always good information, and it's really important, I think, certainly for council, but for the whole community to understand how it is that we live up to the oft-stated principle that new growth will pay for growth. And this largely tells the story. So thanks for doing the work. I'm happy to support the bylaw. So the discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. I'll move the council give second reading to Offsite Levy Bylaw 2018-06. Discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. I'll look for council to approve going to third reading for the bylaw. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And I'll move the council give third reading to Offsite Levy Bylaw 2018-06. Discussion on that motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on to item F2, which is Bylaw 2018-02, Code of Conduct for Elected Officials. Ms. Hyde.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. So we're here this evening to talk about a new bylaw called the Code of Conduct for Elected Officials. A little background on why we're bringing a bylaw about Code of Conduct forward to Council. Back in October, some changes to the MGA came into effect that require all councils in Alberta to establish by bylaw a Code of Conduct for elected officials. Also in October, the Minister of Municipal Affairs approved a regulation that sets out the requirements for the contents, and that's included in your package. And essentially, the minister set out a regulation covering what the content needs to be of the bylaw, how complaints are addressed, what kind of sanctions a council could impose in the event the bylaw was contravened. And they also set out a deadline for everyone to have their bylaw in effect by July 23rd, 2018. So when it came time for us to take a stab at drafting the bylaw, we looked at what we had in place already. We had 3 policies in effect already that included council. We also looked for some other sources of information that we already had. There was an employee code of conduct policy. There was a guide that was published by AUMA and AAMDC, plus Alberta Municipal Affairs, that kind of came out at the 11th hour, but it was a good guide. We had a look at a few bylaws and policies from other municipalities. They're just starting to come out now. And then back in January 2018, you will recall that we had a workshop for a few hours, and you had a chance to review and make comments on what was being proposed. So I wasn't going to go through the whole part of the contents, but I did want to just touch on a couple of things, and the first one was the conflict of interest section. So the MGA, Section 183 of the MGA sets out that a councillor present at a meeting must vote unless you are required or permitted to abstain by legislation. So if you're here, you have to vote unless some pretty specific things apply. So one of those requirements is also in the MGA, it's Section 172, and it speaks to a specific type of conflict of interest, that's pecuniary interest. So pecuniary interest is a specific thing, and it's this. It's if a manner could monetarily affect you or your employer, or if you know or should know that it could affect your family. And your family is defined in the Act also. The Act also, this section is quite robust. It also sets out 12 exceptions to this sort of general rule as well. So the MGA is very specific when it comes to this requirement, but what it leaves us deciding on is conflicts that are not pecuniary. So what we tried to do in the bylaw in Section 9 is to refer to the Municipal Government Act when it's pecuniary, and then come up with some way we could address conflicts that aren't pecuniary. An example might be if you sit on a board. I think it's come up here before, where if someone is, or not a board, like a community association like Rotary. So you're a member of Rotary, and Rotary has made an application for, say, funding. That is not, it doesn't fall under the definition in the MGA of pecuniary to you. You're not excused from voting on that matter, but it can make you feel uncomfortable. You still feel like you have a conflict, right? So how to address that? So we took the opportunity to try to address it in here. So what we're suggesting is, if you're in a situation like that, you would declare your conflict or your perceived conflict before council took the vote. You're still required to vote. You would vote, and then your reason would be recorded in the minutes. So as kind of a made-in-Canmore approach, I haven't seen this addressed in too many of the other bylaws out there yet, so it's a good experiment. I hope it meets with what you would like to have done to address pecuniary interest.
Do you want us to interrupt?
Sorry, and yes, do you have any questions?
I can wait till the end of your presentation and come back.
No, go ahead.
So on that specific one, because it's something we've dealt with quite a bit, agonized over at times.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between a councillor believing that they have a conflict of interest that's not pecuniary, and believing that another person may perceive that. There's a big difference. And I don't know if we can be more clear in the bylaw about that. It's just that, you know, I'm thinking back to an example a few years back now where Councillor McCallum and I were perceived to be in conflict by a neighborhood group around the decision on one of the CCHC projects, because we sat on the CCHC board, so we had a conflict of interest, which clearly doesn't exist under the MGA.
Yeah.
And if we had this bylaw in place, I wouldn't personally think that I had a conflict of interest in that matter, but I would understand that it's perceived in some parts of the community in that way. So I suppose when the councillor is making that declaration, it should be made clear whether the councillor feels they actually do have a non-pecuniary conflict of interest, or they just understand that that's a perception in the community.
So verbatim what is proposed in the bylaw right now, it says, in the event a council member believes they have a conflict of interest that is not pecuniary, or where they believe another person may perceive them to have a conflict of interest that is not pecuniary, the council member shall declare the interest before they vote on the matter. And that declared interest will be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. So I don't know if that covers it. I know what you're saying, like, you don't believe you have a conflict, but you want to address the fact that you understand others do.
So it would be a little awkward. You'd have to declare that you understand that some of the community may feel that there's a non-pecuniary conflict of interest, but you personally, as the councillor, don't feel there is.
Yeah.
So we'll have to deal with that as it comes up.
Yeah,
I mean, the wording within the draft bylaw allows for some variation there, but just for going forward, I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I agree.
I wouldn't say that I have a conflict of interest.
I think the intent, from my point of view anyways, was to really allow council with an opportunity to speak to something that's not covered by the MGA. So I think leaving at your discretion to read this section and then understand if it applies to you and it's something you wanted to speak to at the time of a vote.
Yeah. And maybe we'll come back and beat that up again.
Yeah.
There's questions, but the CAO, did you have a point?
Yes, I just thought it might be helpful to use an example to expand on Ms. Hyde's response there. So in the past, there was an example where Councillor Russell thought he might have a perceived conflict of interest by virtue of, it was actually Cause Canada being a client of his security business. So he checked with me, and at the council meeting, he actually stated, I've checked with the CAO, there might be this perceived conflict of interest. It is not a pecuniary conflict of interest, and therefore I am permitted to vote on this item. So it just makes it clear that it's not pecuniary, and you're permitted to vote. But by stating it, it says that that councillor has turned their mind to that question of perception. And I think it was just helpful for them to do that.
Yeah. Thank you. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. So then my next question is still on this matter. If you have the wording of the bylaw as it sits, I've swam all over my
9.3.
Thank you very much. 9.3, it says, in the event a council member has a conflict of interest, or where they believe another person may perceive them to have a conflict of interest that is not pecuniary. So what if the perception of that non-pecuniary interest is so remote that it didn't actually come to the councillor's mind? Is that actually then something that a complaint can be filed on?
That's exactly my question.
Because, so my husband swings a hammer for a living. So I vote on a construction project that he has nothing to do with whatsoever, but there's swarming out there somewhere in the deep dark hole of social media that, oh, well, her husband's in construction, so she shouldn't have been able to vote. And that is so far removed from, you could swing a hammer in Calgary, right? But that's so far removed from any kind of conflict of interest, pecuniary or otherwise, quite frankly, that if I don't actually identify it at the front end, then is that something that then that could be brought forward as a complaint under the complaint section?
Yeah, so, well, it's something to think about. This is all fresh territory, right?
Yeah, right.
Fresh territory. So the original language in here actually was something more like, in the event a council member believes, or it was shorter, it said if they believe or believe they have a conflict or a perceived conflict. That was the original language, and we weren't finding that clear enough, so it got more wordy. But the idea is to allow you to express something. And we don't want to have the wording to be something that obligates you to know everything that's going on in social media, for example. That's not the intent. Like, the intent is to allow you an opportunity to speak when the MGA is not permitting you to abstain from a vote.
Yeah, I just.
So, you know what?
I get,
I
and
mean, for an amendment,
totally agree with
I'd
the
have to think about
process
it, but,
behind of
yeah.
I just, the nefarious possibility behind it
Yeah.
is what kind of worries me. Like,
Yeah.
you could waste a lot of time. Like, we just voted on the offset levy model. I'm building a house next year.
Yeah, well,
Should I have declared
I mean, I don't want to
that?
quote
You
the
know what I
MGA
mean?
without
But
it right in
that's
front
one
of
those
me.
things, it's like, it's sort of, or I'm buying a house, like, do you know what I mean? Like, it
yeah,
can be.
but the MGA provides for you being members of the community.
I
right?
understand
Like,
that, I just wonder,
yeah.
I'm just trying to ensure, and I'm not sure if it can be insured. I think it's one of those things where we gotta throw out the Frisbee and see where it lands, and
Yeah.
then maybe in a year come back and amend some things that maybe are not working. I just, that's one thing that concerns me, you know? Like, we're all people in this community that do
Yeah.
different things and have different interests. You know, when we were voting on Arts Place several years ago, there were people, they were accusing the mayor of being in conflict of interest, even because he's an artist. That's ridiculous.
Used to be.
Used to be an artist.
Used to be.
I think we'll just move on because
Yeah,
there's other
Move on?
but you
questions.
know where I'm
Okay.
We
going.
can, you
yeah.
know, during the debate or the discussion on the bylaw itself, once the motion's forward, we might want to consider that, but Councillor
Okay.
Comfort, you have a question?
Yeah, I just was wondering, in the same vein, would that not be possible to just address when you were speaking to the matter before council? Like, so rather than actually having something in the bylaw that pertains to something that is in someone's head, how the heck do I know what that is? And isn't relevant anyway, isn't germane
Yeah.
to the issue. The pecuniary interest is. So I'm trying to think of a not objectionable way to say this, but I don't see it as my job to educate the populace on proper process and what's right and what's
Yeah.
wrong. If they need to inform themselves, they should inform themselves what the law says. So I understand the intent of this, and we asked for something like this. But the only thing that's really relevant is the pecuniary interest, and you can certainly speak to that, you know, and you can speak to this other, right? Because because it's a small community particularly, and because we don't have wards, we are part of everything that goes on. So it will be an issue from time to time. So I would explain, you know, for instance, when we have grants come forward, Folk Fest, I was a member of the Folk Fest board, but it never occurred to me to sort of say, well, would I vote on that, or would I mention that? But, okay, so I'm going to propose an amendment to this when we come to that part.
Okay.
But it troubles me also.
Yeah. I mean, we're in new territory here, as
Yeah.
is every other municipality, even though a lot of municipalities, including Canmore, has had similar documents, but not quite as meaty as this, and generally not bylaw, but policy. So, sorry, we interrupted your
Oh, no, that's
procedure.
fine.
Report.
It's better to talk about when we're on it.
Okay, back to
Yep.
it.
All right. So I was only going to touch on one other part of the content, and that was the part about reflecting on previous votes. So this used to be a section in our procedural bylaw, and when you passed our new procedural bylaw for this term of council, we took it out and said we would address it in this bylaw. So this is what it said. A member shall refrain from reflecting on a previous vote of council except when moving to reconsider it, and refrain from reflecting on the motives of the mover of the motions or members who voted on the previous motion. So looking at that now, I mean, I don't believe that the intent was to prevent reflection on previous votes. And I made the example in my staff report. We have a whole section in our staff report that we're meant to fill in the previous votes of council. So I don't think the intention there was ever to prevent reflection. I think it was more around respectful discussions. It was to prevent a disrespectful reflection on previous motions. And I think that kind of behavior shouldn't be limited just to reflecting on previous motions. It should be all the time, right? So I think 7.1 in the new bylaw is meant to, it's meant to address all of all of your, not me, I've got my own policy, all of your interactions, right? So you shall demonstrate respect for the process, each other, and members of the public. And I did want to point out, too, that the respectful workplace policy applies to council and has for some time, actually, and it details areas that the town consider to be inappropriate or disrespectful. So I personally think it's covered, and I didn't propose anything in this new bylaw to talk about reflecting on previous votes specifically.
Yeah. We've talked quite a bit about this through the discussions leading up to this evening, and I've certainly struggled with that one and gone back and forth on it. You know, under the previous policy, it was quite clear, and the intent was to basically prohibit or encourage councillors. There was no way of enforcing it, but encourage councillors not to be out in the community slagging some decision of council because they didn't support it. That was the full intent. The downside was if that happened, there was no way of reprimanding the council or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, by including something in the bylaw, that gives, bless you.
Bless you.
If that should ever arise, and I'm sure it wouldn't with this council, there is something within a bylaw that the councillor could be held to task. So,
well, there's another section too, actually, I should have put on this slide. There's 4.3 under communicating on behalf of the municipality. And 4.4.
That's the clause that adds a little comfort to myself, to my consideration.
Oh, and here we go. Look at 5.2. Council members shall accept and accurately communicate the decisions of council, even when they disagree with council's decision.
That's right.
So that was meant to cover that.
So given those two additional statements, you know,
yeah, I should have added those to the slide, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know, with that in mind, the change or the proposed 7.1, I mean, respect for the process infers all of those other things, but it is more clearly stated in a couple of the other clauses.
In 5.2, yeah.
Yeah.
Bad slide.
Unless there's other questions on that
Any other questions?
component.
So I was going to move next on to the complaint process. I was going to move away from content. So the complaint process is another brand new thing for every municipality, so there's not any real best practice to look at yet. But we did look at a few different things, and administration is recommending that council use a model where the investigator would be a third-party individual. We're recommending someone a person or a company that would be experienced in mediation, understand how to read a bylaw, somebody who maybe has familiarity with municipal government. That's kind of the idea that we have. Interestingly enough, most of the bylaws that are posted right now, councils are choosing to have council be the investigator. And I mean, it'll be interesting to see how some of these things play out, but you know, we talked about it in the workshop, we've talked about administration. We really felt that a third party really is a better way to get some impartiality. So, yeah, I don't know what will happen if you approve the bylaw the way it's written now, where we intend to post an expression of interest and welcome some proposals from companies or individuals that feel they're qualified for the position. So the complaint process, and I saw that, this mouse. Oh. There we go. I didn't know how to do the little boxes on the slide, so I had to go to Word. But anyway, I just thought we'd walk through the process for complaints and see if you have any questions. Just start from the top. So the idea would be that anyone can submit a complaint. It wouldn't have to be a resident. It could be any person who has reason to believe that a contravention of the bylaw has taken place could submit a complaint to the investigator. They can't be anonymous. The investigator needs to know the name of the person. They need to be made in writing, and they have to include reasonable grounds in the complaint. So once an investigator receives a complaint, they would have to make a decision whether or not that they were going to conduct an investigation. So the bylaw also sets out reasons that they could decide not to continue. So it might be a matter that's not addressed in the bylaw. It wouldn't be appropriate. The complainant may not be able to provide sufficient grounds for the complaint. Or the other part is the complaint is frivolous, vexatious, or not made in good faith. That would be, those are usually complaints of a continuing nature that are the same complaint made by the same person that always seeking a new resolution. So that would be an example maybe of something that would fall under that. There are fairly rare. It's a section that's in the FOIP Act as well, and it's actually something that not happens all that often. Doesn't happen all that often. So if the investigator at that time decided not to proceed with the complaint, they would dismiss it, they'd notify the applicant, and council would only receive statistical report at the end of the year saying, you know, I dismissed one complaint this year. Something like that. So the name of the person would not be shared. If the decision is to go on and investigate the complaint, the investigator would open an investigation, notify the applicant, and notify the council member of the complaint. So unless there was a reason under FOIP, which is that the disclosure of the complainant's name could reasonably be expected to threaten anyone else's safety or mental or physical health or interfere with public safety, the counselor would be provided with the name of the person who lodged the complaint. And the counselor, I'm just reading along here, the counselor has an opportunity to submit their own version of events. And then the investigation would continue. If the investigator determined that a violation had not occurred, they have the authority to close the complaint, notify everyone, and council would hear about it in statistical form. If they found reason to believe that a violation had occurred, the first step would be to try to resolve the complaint through mediation. And all of the bylaws that I've seen from other municipalities are quite strong on this as well. The idea, I think, of this whole bylaw is to encourage good behavior. The punishment is kind of a real last resort, right? The sanctions. I think, you know, the idea that I'm seeing out there is that the more that could be resolved through mediation, the better. If something can be resolved through mediation, again, the complaint would be closed. You'd hear about it in statistics. If, at the end of the day, the complaint is valid, mediation either can occur or didn't work, the investigator has to make a report to council. So this report at a high level would be available in a public meeting because your decisions have to be made in public. But we would follow FOIP very carefully when it comes to disclosing any kind of personal information. So what you'd probably be looking at would be a high-level report outlining the violation and the sanctions recommended, if any, and then you would probably have to go in camera to hear the details of the case. Again, the complainant's name and the counselor's name would be released unless there was a valid reason, probably the safety of one of the individuals under FOIP, that we wouldn't release it. I think it's really important that the process is public as possible while still protecting people's personal information. So if we got to that, if there was a report to council, council would need to make a decision. So the decision is not whether or not to support the investigator's findings. The decision is whether or not to apply sanctions, and in the case that you wish to, which one. And then the sanctions themselves.
Can we just talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
If you're moving on.
I was just going to say what the sanctions were.
Okay.
Those are set out by the regulation from the minister. Yeah, but we can back up to that other slide.
Yeah, and you and I had a short conversation earlier today around the whole nature of frivolous, vexatious, or not made in good faith. So is there a difference in law, and I might look to Mr. Fark for this, difference in law between frivolous, vexatious, and not made in good faith?
In short, yes. They are different, different standards of review. So frivolous is essentially having no merit or probability of success. Vexatious is with the intent to, essentially with malice. And what was the third one again?
Not made in good faith.
Not made in good faith.
Not made in faith. So I think the definition of that one is fairly straightforward.
Yeah. So what I've been curious about and talking a little bit about is having another section in the bylaw suggesting that if the investigator should find that a complaint is frivolous or not made in good faith, I'll avoid vexatious, then the town would invoice the complainer for the costs incurred by the town, which may not be insignificant. And I throw that out for general discussion before there's a motion on the table.
So if, Ms. Hyde, would you prefer that or would you like to?
You go ahead. I'll add. I've got my own idea too, but I can't add on.
So the standard of review, essentially the bar for a frivolous, vexatious, or not in good faith is very high. So in the legal sense, to demonstrate that somebody has been frivolous, vexatious, or not acting in good faith, it requires quite a high evidentiary burden. Whereas the bar, what we call the standard for just making a complaint, is quite low. You just have to meet the grounds that are stated in the bylaw. And so there are some legislations, acts in Alberta that do specify a penalty for frivolous and vexatious, but they are generally adjudicated by a higher body. So it is not generally the jurisdiction in question that is able to levy the fine. So I think it would be, I mean, we would have to check with an actual lawyer, not just one who plays one on television. But we would probably have to get a legal review as to whether or not we had the legislative authority to impose such a fine. I would question whether or not we would have the ability to do that. One of the main reasons is, and you see the same thing with the court system, imposing that or including that would have what they call a chilling effect. So it might act as a deterrent from people who might otherwise feel they have a legitimate grievance from doing so for fear of being retaliated against with this type of fine. And so the justice system in general is reluctant to levy those types of fines, and that's why the bar is quite high.
Which is exactly the same answer you gave me last time we talked about it a couple of hours ago. But then in that case, if there's a very high bar on judging something to be frivolous or vexatious or not made in good faith, how can the investigator make that judgment?
So there's a difference between the investigator determining that the complaint has no merit from the investigator determining that it was not only with no merit, but made with either frivolous, vexatious, or lack of good faith intent, right? So the investigator can determine that it has no merit or it may seem frivolous. But again, in law, classifying someone or a complaint as frivolous and vexatious is quite an extreme step. In my previous work, we had an individual who submitted, I think it was, we hit up to 30 or 31 different complaints before we were prepared to take the step of pursuing a frivolous and vexatious.
Fair enough. But I'm still thinking that if the investigator receives a complaint and the matter is arguably within the investigator's authority to investigate, and there are no grounds or insufficient grounds for if there are grounds for conducting an investigation, but the investigator feels it's frivolous or not made in good faith, they couldn't very well dismiss the complaint on that point.
The investigator could, and I believe that that is exactly what the bylaw says. What they couldn't do is levy a penalty against the person who launches the complaint by virtue of the fact that they have determined it to be with that intent.
Fair enough. Councillor Comfort?
Yeah, I just had a question on that. If the investigator looks at it and says, I understand why you're upset, but you don't really, this isn't a valid complaint, could they offer to the complainant that they can withdraw their complaint prior to things going public, as it were, to avoid embarrassment and like that.
Yep. You know, if they dismiss it at either of the first two steps, the complaint doesn't go public. Like in the first instance, not even the counselor is aware of the complaint. That's the proposal. And in the second instance, only the counselor would be. Because the same thing may happen at mediation, I'm thinking.
Oh, sure.
Someone may actually get together and determine they can work something out between them. And the intent is that could stay between the complainant and the counselor and the mediator.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Because, yes, I agree.
Did you have a bit more you wanted to?
I think I just had the sanctions. Oh. Figure out how to drive this bus, though. So I think you've probably had a chance to look at these, but one thing that's important to note in the Act is you can't impose any sanctions that would prevent a counselor from carrying out their duties under the Act. So you could never prevent someone from voting. You could never prevent someone from coming to a council meeting. Those kind of things are not on the table at all. But these are the kind of things which result, like in pretty extreme, at the end, suspension of remuneration. But I mean, they start out with a letter of apology. So that's the kind of sanction that the minister has foreseen.
Is that reduction? Is that last bullet supposed to say reduction or?
Oh yes, reduction or suspension of remuneration.
So then, it's as simple as it sounds. Council could vote to reduce councillors' base wages by X amount or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Or per diem.
Okay.
Yep. And that just leaves me with the recommendations that you give 3 readings to the Council Code of Conduct bylaw as presented or with amendments, and that you repeal our existing council governance policy EX001 because the intent is that will be replaced by this bylaw. The end.
Great. So I'll just ask a couple of questions before there's a motion on the table so that you can be part of the conversation. Section, where is it? Where it sets out the who an investigator could be. Section 13. Where it says the investigator could be a company, blah, blah, blah. What section?
Oh, that's in the staff report. All the bylaw says about the investigator is the council shall appoint a person to act as the investigator. That's 16.1. So
Pardon
the
me,
definition
16.1?
16.1. Council shall appoint a person to act as an investigator.
Right.
The part about...
it's 16.2 I was looking for.
Yeah.
So not eligible to act as the investigator, or a council member, or yada yada, or a town employee. I'm wondering about the advisability of having a third reason that an investigator wouldn't be eligible or somebody wouldn't be eligible, which is if they're a resident of Canmore or own property in Canmore. And I really want to throw that out for a broad discussion before there's a motion. Because it may not be necessary, but my sense is that no matter how wonderful councillors are, there seems to be some people in the community that are unhappy with either all of council or individual councillors and may have a bias against that councillor or all of council, and the bias may not be strongly evident. So if the hiring is done in good faith, I'm just thinking if one of the prerequisites was the investigator wasn't a resident of Canmore, that would preclude that possibility. But I may be getting a little too deep in the weeds there. Do you have a thought off the top, and other councillors can...
Well, one of my thoughts off the top is I think the process should be as easy as possible. So my concern would be if it's a person that doesn't live or work in Canmore, it might be difficult to meet with them. I wouldn't want to have someone travel or have to wait. I don't know. I was thinking about that. I would like the process to be easy. The other thing is council will be the body hiring this individual. So if there were any concerns about relationship bias at that time, that they should come up at that time. And the third thing I was thinking, I just look at council, like you're all members of the community and you're elected to make, unbiased decisions, and you do a great job. I think there's probably a lot of members in this community that are capable of the same. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Anybody want to weigh in, or anybody have thoughts? Councillor McCallum?
I always have thoughts. Some of them scarier than others. I don't have any issue with it being a member of our community or otherwise. I think, honestly, there may be an opportunity here, maybe not right off the hop, but as this whole policy develops in other municipalities and everybody gets their ducks lined up, to be able to collaborate with other communities and perhaps hire a similar person, which would make it worthwhile for the person who's applying for the position.
Yeah.
And I think of like the police committee, and we had a complaints investigator, and not many complaints have come forward, but that was a lot of responsibility for that person to be around, to be available. Yeah. I don't believe we actually paid them anything. It was a volunteer position, and difficult position to find in the first place, and then probably a difficult one to replace as well when they moved on. So I think I agree with Ms. Hyde. I would prefer to keep it simple. And remember, we're throwing this Frisbee out, and I played a lot of Frisbee on the beach.
Frisbees come back on you.
Yeah, well, those are boomerangs.
Frisbees
You're from Australia. But, we have the opportunity to amend this down the road, and we can insert a sunset clause on it in terms of we have to review it if we really want to hold ourselves to that. That can occur as well.
The regulation, I believe, says you have to review it every 4 years.
Okay, but we could review it.
But you can review it anytime.
Somebody could bring forward a notice of motion, and we could review it again if we wanted to.
In regards to the sharing of an investigator with other municipalities, we've talked about that before, and Banff is the obvious choice, but Banff isn't going to be required to have a code of conduct for some time yet, it turns out.
Yes, Banff provincial legislation doesn't apply to Banff until the federal government passes an amendment to their incorporation agreement, because they're inside a national park incorporated by the federal government. Right. So they said they could be anywhere between 6 months and 2 years from that regulation coming into effect for them.
Regardless.
But they're open to a partnership
There's Cochrane,
when that day comes.
Yeah, it might be worth down the road.
Or Cochrane,
yeah. Absolutely.
The MD of Bighorn, they'd be obliged to have a code of conduct as well.
Where?
The MD of Bighorn.
MD, yep.
It's just to the east here.
Yep, those guys over there, yeah. Yep, they all have one by July 23rd as well.
Okay. Councillor Sanford, you had
Thank you, Worship. I just had a question for Ms. Hyde on number 12, the orientation and other training attendance. So there's a clause in there that says, unless excused by council, council members must attend. Now, this orientation is something that's being mandated by the province?
Yes.
And so how we wouldn't just be able to opt out of it because we had to go to work or because we were away on vacation or something. We would have to, what would be the mechanism for council to approve in absence?
Council can only decide by bylaw or motion, right? So if council needs to excuse a member, it would have to be by a council resolution.
Okay, so if there was an orientation planned and someone felt they couldn't be there, it would have to come to council.
And council would have to decide if you were going to be excused or not.
Okay.
The discussion around this actually was the amended act now requires all municipalities to provide orientation to new councils within, I think it's 90 days, but there's nothing in the act that says a councillor has to attend. So, or there was nothing in the act that says a councillor has to attend. So it's being addressed in these bylaws now.
So this just makes it
Yeah.
apparent, very clear that it has to be excused by council through council motion.
Well, I think what happens in a lot of places is councillors don't attend.
Just don't show up. period.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this just solidifies that obligation.
Yeah.
And
You have to be
exemption.
excused. And it's just that particular orientation.
Right.
And any training that is mandated or that you've organized purposely by a council. So it's not whether or not you go to the AUMA conference. Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that because that's an important thing for council to know, that there's a substantial decision to be made there. Right, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Did you have another question, Councillor? Deep sigh. Are there any other questions for Ms. Hyde while she's standing here? I have another question. In 9.6, what's 9.5, 9.6, anywhere in there, about accepting a token or gift. More, no what? Yeah, right. Yeah, really. So 9.6, council members may not accept cash or gift cards, certificates that have monetary value, with the exception of donations made to support a charitable cause. So that would cover such things as walk a mile, or I regularly
Where you're
receive
raising money. Yeah, that's
money.
the intention.
Right. Now then, I'm curious.
Not if they have a monetary value.
Yeah.
No
So-
money.
And would that apply equally to an event like the hospital the hospital golf tournament fundraiser, where typically EPCOR will host 4 members of the town, either council or, so that would fall in under there?
Yep. This actually aligns with the employee policy as well for.
Right.
So that align with.
Employee policy.
No, before that, you said, would that align with, and you didn't get to finish your sentence. Oh.
With 9.6.
Oh, I thought you
So 9.6 would include like a round of golf for the hospital golf fundraising thing or whatever.
It's meant to include, yes, things that support a charitable cause, and it's meant to support too, just 9.5A, part of the normal exchange of hospitality among persons doing business. So a lot of that stuff falls under that as well.
Okay. And clearly we can, as this plays out, there'll be questions of councillors, and Ms. Hyde could be the go-to for these questions, or myself, and we'll figure it out. Section 13.9, the notwithstanding section, the investigator will not disclose the name of the person, and you talked a bit about this. The name of the person who submitted the complaint if investigator determines yada yada. Can you give me any examples of what you had in mind, or?
Yeah, so this language is out of the FOIP Act, and the City of Calgary, for example, has had they've had a similar process in effect for a few years. They actually have an Office of an Integrity Commissioner that they established, it seems like maybe about 2 years ago, and they have a policy that's called their whistleblowers policy, and it's meant to protect particularly employees coming forward, and it's not just councillors. I think it applied to councillors and other staff, if I'm not mistaken. But it was to protect the whistleblower. So if I believe someone is embezzling, and I want to report it, but I'm worried I'll be fired for reporting it, that's meant to protect me from that. So that's what that language is around. It's really to address fear of retaliation.
Okay, thank you. That helps. And I have just one other question. Under 15.1, complaint parameters. In the period 90 days prior to the day of the municipal election, investigator may suspend any investigation underway or decline to commence an investigation, which makes sense. I'm just curious where the 90 days came from. Is there a rationale behind that, or?
No, I copied it from the guide.
And the intent of that is?
I believe the intent of that is to prevent this bylaw as being used to influence an election.
Right. So typically, electors know there's an election coming long before 90 days before. So if that's the intent, what would preclude an investigation being filed or a complaint being filed 100 days before an election?
Yeah, and you know what else? It's a may, right? This is just giving the inspector the opportunity. Again, the inspector's going to have to make some calls, right? So if the inspector receives a complaint that he feels should be followed up and it's within the 90 days, the inspector can still follow up that complaint. But if the investigator suspects that, I would say if he suspects it might influence a candidate's chances of being reelected, he might want to look at that, right? I think that's why it's in there. But I don't know why the 90 days. The nomination period's just 4 weeks, right?
Yeah, I guess it's sort of throwing a dart at a dartboard. That's the right date. Okay, that's all the questions I have, which is good. It's answered some of the things I was considering amending motions to, so
all right.
It'll move quicker through that. Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Your Worship. So just to carry on that, the nomination period is only 4 weeks, but we can file intent like tomorrow.
Yep. You can file an intent the day after the election. Yeah.
So
yeah, honestly, it's a dart at a dartboard.
It is a dart and a dartboard.
Okay, are there any other questions or discussion to be had before the motion goes on the table?
Seeing none?
Excuse me. That's my job.
I've seen this movie before.
Seeing none.
I did want to mention that I didn't schedule a break on the agenda, and you just might want to keep it in mind.
Well, I think we're doing okay. Mr. Meyer is sitting there patiently waiting for the 2026 item, and it's coming. Maybe you too, I don't know. Okay, so with that, I'll move the council give first reading to Bylaw 2018-02, Code of Conduct for Elected Officials. And I'll speak to the motion, as I expect everybody will, but this is the sort of we've had our policy in place for years that guides conduct, what's appropriate conduct for councillors, but more and more, there's an expectation that elected officials are held to a higher standard than everybody else. And I think it's I think it's a good thing that councils are being asked to create through bylaw, a code of conduct that's very specific and has meaning and meat, and it adds that extra really significant level of transparency and accountability. Of course, to some extent, I'm going into this with a little trepidation because you never know how things may play out. But I'm happy to support first reading because I think it's a good bylaw that Ms. Hyatt has written after a lot of discussion with council and other administration. I think this is something that our community will accept really happily, see that we've drafted a really comprehensive bylaw. So I'm happy to support this motion. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think that what has been proposed for a code of conduct bylaw is very good. I think that there are a lot of protections in place for parties through the process of having an investigator. And I think to keep in mind that the investigator has to act on the advice or the information provided in the MGA. So if people feel that a frivolous complaint would be reviewed by an investigator in a favorable light, I think that councillors are protected by the clauses in the MGA, and I think that putting the onus on the investigator to determine whether a complaint is valid or vexatious, or perhaps not, brought in good faith. I think this process kind of protects us from that, and I don't think it automatically goes to a full-blown investigation, because I think there are steps that have been very carefully crafted in here to make the process fair. I think that's what we're after, is to make the process fair, but also to hold us accountable. I mean, we want to avoid problems as much as possible. So I think the accountability lies with us, and I think it always has. This clarifies the process. If for some reason people feel that something has been breached, then it gives the community an opportunity to raise that. To your point about having people from outside the community being the investigator or serving as in that function, everybody is, one step removed from the potential of being influenced by somebody from Canmore. So I don't know that that is something that's too much of a concern, because I think if you hire the right person with the right professional qualifications, they will do a good job and hold the MGA as the process that has to be, viewed. The complaint would have to be reviewed through a particular lens, and I think if we hire the right investigator, it doesn't matter where they live. But again, if we can coordinate an investigator with other communities, that would be very useful. So I think the bylaw is very fair, and I'm more than happy to support it.
Councillor Comfort?
Yes, I also will support this. There's a ton of work that went into this workshops and at a level beyond ours as well, very high level. I did want to propose an amendment, if I may.
Yeah.
To 9.3, and the whole notion of vexatious complaints or nuisance complaints. When it says the council member shall declare the interest before they vote on the matter, that means that we have to do that, right? If there's a perceived conflict of interest, we have to declare that perceived conflict of interest.
If you believe that you have that conflict of interest, if you believe that about yourself, and it's not pecuniary, then this would, this is definite. You shall declare that you believe you have a conflict of interest.
So going back to Councillor McCallum's question about that, would that provide the hook to hang a complaint on? If someone on the outside says, wait a minute, I perceive that you have a conflict of interest. It just seems, anyway, I would like to change the shall to may, so that you have the option. You can declare it or not, which is how it sits at the moment, right? When you speak to your vote, you can say, I'm conflicted because yada, yada, yada. But it takes away that hook for somebody that has not the best motives, perhaps. Just makes it clear. It's up to the councillor.
Councillor McCallum?
I'm down with that. No, I see where you're going with that, because it's not, it's where it's pecuniary, which is where the legitimate hook lay. And to Ms. Hyde's point about giving councillors an opportunity to have a voice, to be able to speak to perhaps what they're hearing in the community or not necessarily hearing directly in the community, then there's an opportunity to speak to that. And it's stated, it's in the bylaw, it's not necessarily awkward. I guess I'm worried too, Your Worship, about, there's a level of mind reading required with the way it's written currently, and I'm not that good at it. So,
yeah, when I
thinking.
Sorry, were you finished?
Yes.
Yeah. So I looked at that clause quite a bit and mulled it over. Changing shall to may softens it a bit. But it's the middle section where they believe another person may perceive them to have a conflict of interest. So that's where it gets muddy.
But they're joined.
So if somebody in the community should say that, I don't know, they perceived I had a conflict of interest and I didn't declare it, I mean, obviously my argument is, well, I didn't perceive that. You know, if I perceive that I have a conflict of interest of my own, that's a little more black and white. But to be able, as Councillor McCallum says, to mind read.
I don't think it's fair to expect councillors to mind read, but I do think it's fair, Your Worship, to allow us the opportunity to speak to misconception and perception, which is not necessarily reality.
Are you speaking to this amending motion, Councillor Hillstead? Yeah.
I agree with that. Putting the may, like for me, it would be more when it's the other person may perceive it. So putting the may in there, again, but you just stated very clearly also that you can just use that as your argument that, well, I didn't think that you would think that, so, but that's why I agree with the adding the may, just because it does give us the option that, you know, if we don't think there's any perceived interest out there, but then it comes up later that, oh, a bunch of people thought there was, well, I didn't declare it because I didn't think so, but.
Sure. So you're inclined to support the amendment?
Yes.
Councillor Comfort, did you have something more on that?
Not unless somebody else wants to.
Councillor Sanford?
Yes, I would support the use of that word may in the place of the use of the word shall. But how I perceive that clause of a member who believes another person may perceive that the member's non-pecuniary, personal, or private interest may influence their vote, I think that's an opportunity to dispel myths, because a lot of myths get created around councillors' interests in particular things. And in fact, the MJ says the only interest that allows you to abstain from voting is if it's a pecuniary interest, if there's actually money that is potentially made or gained from that interest. But in the community, I think there are a lot of myths about what actually councillors should be abstaining to vote from. So just the language in there gives us the opportunity to address things that might be non-pecuniary, but give us an opportunity to speak to it. So may, I think, covers that opportunity, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that we feel that way, but potentially that maybe from our associations or our connections or what we do in the community might put us into a situation where people might perceive that. So I don't find that confronting. I just think it's an opportunity for us.
Okay, thank you. Is there other discussion on Councillor Comfort's amending motion to change the word shall to may? Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Back then to the first reading of the motion as amended. Is there further discussion on that? See none, so I'll be calling the question to give first reading to the bylaw as amended. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. I'll then move the council give second reading to Bylaw 2018-02, the Code of Conduct for Elected Officials. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And I'll move the council go to third reading of the bylaw. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And I'll move the council give third reading to Bylaw 2018-02, Code of Conduct for Elected Officials. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And I think I'll take a 10-minute break at this point. Just because And we'll move on to item G1, the rink replacement and vault toilet installation in Larch. We have new staff, Ms. Bernard. I know you were introduced to the rest of council, but
hello.
Welcome to the town of Canmore.
Thank you.
And this is your first time in front of council, so we have a policy of going easy on staff, first time in front.
I've heard that, especially since my whole department's away, so thank you. So as mentioned, I'm the newest member of the Public Works Department. I'm the project coordinator there, and I'll be presenting to you an update of the Larch Rink replacement project. So I'll go through just an overview of the presentation. I'll give you a little bit of a background to the rink. Then we'll go through the process of how we came up with the original site design or the draft site design, and then our final site design, and our process of how we came up with that. So as you may be aware, the town of Canmore manages and maintains the Larch Rink in both the winter and the summer months. Amenities in addition to the rink ice include a basketball court, as well as facilities such as a rented portable toilet, picnic tables, waste receptacles, and the water source for flooding the rink. The rink was originally constructed in 1987, and it's reached its end of life cycle. So in 2017, the decision was made to demolish the existing rink and to build a new one during the construction of the nearby housing. Budget was also approved to allow for construction of a wheelchair accessible vault toilet, and the amenities that are currently there, such as the receptacles, picnic table, etc., those will stay in place. Some enhancements will also be made to the rink, and this will include an enclosed players box, as well as there will be permanent lines for the Pickleball Association. The basketball court will be put back in place on the new rink surface. The surface is going to be a concrete surface rather than this asphalt surface that we currently have. And there's also going to be some off-street parking and pathways. Okay, so this diagram, this is our original concept plan that we came up with. When we began, we started off with different groups from the town administration. So we pulled members from the engineering, planning group, park supervision and operations team, as well as the town's communication specialists. We began by creating a list of the positive things with the existing rink, as well as opportunities for improvements, the weaknesses of the current rink. Some of the items that we considered were the rink orientation, and we considered visibility with the sun, tree occupation, and so that would include where the needles fell across the site, wind patterns. We also considered proximity to housing and therefore required safety netting that would be needed where the new rink goes, and noise and lighting considerations. The Parks Department had some concerns as well, such as the proximity of the new rink to the water source. If you look at this diagram, the little purple star, that's where the water hydrant is, and that went in just last year, so that's going to stay put. It's not going to be relocated. They also had concerns about access for the Zamboni. As you know, it goes down there several times a week to improve the ice surface, and so it needs a clear access path. As well as they require storage area for snow removal from the ice surface. We also evaluated the pathways. So right now there's no pathways through the site that are permanent pathways. They're just more like goat trails. But the new housing that's going in, they are installing pathways, so we wanted to try to link those up through the green space. We also considered the placement of the vault toilet. So we wanted to keep it in a place that would be well lit rather than hidden in the trees. We felt that it shows that when things are hidden in the trees, then it's more susceptible to vandalism, and this way it's more secure, safer for the community to use. And then finally, we gave consideration to the off-street parking. The existing rink did have parking. Most of that has been consumed by sort of the southwestern portion of the new housing. And so we wanted to make sure that there is some off-street parking with the new rink. And so all those considerations, we came up with this initial draft plan. And this is the plan that we took to the public. we go. So the next phase was our public participation, and that comprised of an online survey as well as an open house. For both of these, we had 4 main components that we took to the public, and they comprised of asking them what they thought of our proposed rink placement, the proposed vault toilet placement, the pathways placement, as well as the parking. We had proposed parking for 7 vehicles, and we asked if the public felt that that was sufficient. And then we followed up, if they didn't feel that was sufficient, would they support removing trees to allow for further parking? So what we heard back from the community was 75 residents completed our online survey, and approximately 30 people dropped into our open house. And the results were as follows. When we asked if they liked the location of the rink, you can see over 80% responded yes. However, approximately 1/3 of those people also responded they would prefer that the rink were moved further to the north and slightly to the west. And this would allow for greater separation between the existing housing and the new housing. They also responded that safety netting was a concern. So although we hadn't put that out there publicly, safety netting will be installed. And in any area that surrounds the housing, so that would be on the east and the south, the netting will be 3 sections high, which is approximately 15 feet high. And that would be what we have over at the Cougar Creek rink. On our second question about the placement of the toilet, we also had a high response that the public approved of where we had placed the original placement, almost 90%. The response that we heard back, though, was that if we were to move the rink to the north, then they would like to see the vault toilet to be moved as well, further to the north. When we asked about the proposed pathways, the response again was quite high, over 80%. Some of the responses, people wanted different pathways, and we had to explain that the pathways that we were proposing are linking up with the existing housing, so we don't want to build something that doesn't attach to that. And responses back were things like they didn't like those pathways, and that's something that's already going to be in place, so we won't really have a chance to change those. When we asked about the parking for up to 7 vehicles, was that sufficient? You can see that the response was fairly different to the other 3 questions. Less than 50% responded that they did think that that was enough parking. And then when we followed up with the question, if that's not sufficient, would you support removing trees? You can see that again, the responses were mixed. Only just slightly under half of the respondents said that they would support removing trees. So one of the comments, if we do expand the parking area, we won't be able to move it to the north, so we'd have to extend it to the south of where we've proposed it, and that's why we would have to remove trees, because there's trees in that area. So just like any engaged community, even though we didn't ask specific questions about these topics, we received back these comments. And some of the things that members of the community would like to see installed include bicycle racks, benches for the pickle players, on-site storage space for these user groups, the basketball players, the pickleball association. We received comments that people would like to see a wooden gazebo similar to the one that's at Three Sisters installed. And then we received quite a few comments about 2 things. Could we not just reuse what we have there, or could we recycle the rink? And the comments back to that, we have investigated if we can reuse what's there, but we're proposing a rink that's slightly larger, and the system, it's not compatible with what we have. So if you think back to what was created in 1987, it's not at the same standards as what is available now. We've learned that if we try to incorporate the 2, we'll probably spend more than we would if we just replaced the entire facility. So in regards to recycling the rink, we are engaging in conversations with the MD of Bighorn, and there's a good chance that they may be interested in coming to take the rink. And we'll let you know more about that.
Can I just interrupt there? So when you talk about taking the rink, are you talking about the boards?
Sorry, just the boards.
Right.
The boards and potentially the fencing as well.
I see. So the surface is a no-brainer. I mean, it's being replaced.
The surface will be demolished and recycled.
And the existing boards potentially could be reused on a different size rink.
It would be, unless they procured additional boards, it would be the same size as what we currently have.
The boards are that old as well, right?
Some of them are.
Pardon me?
Some of them would be that old. Some of them have been replaced throughout since the last 30 years, but some of them are original.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Next step. So when we listened to the community, this was our updated revised design plan. And so the changes that were incorporated into this plan compared to the first one that I put up, the rink has been moved approximately 10 meters to the north and 5 meters to the west. Pathways from the new housing have been realigned to better align with where the rink has gone, as well as to connect to the Larch Island Trail. Off-street parking has been increased from 7 stalls to 10 stalls, and that was done by extending the parking lot to the south. The enclosed players box was relocated to the east side of the rink. Originally we had it on the west side, and what this will do, a couple different things. We need space along the southern portion of the rink to allow for snow removal from the rink and snow storage. So that keeps that area free for us, as well as on the western side. But also, since that players box is now on the east side, any noise that comes from that would be projected towards Larch Island rather than back into the new housing. The vault washroom. So if you were to compare these two designs side by side, you'd see that we actually didn't move the washroom, and there's a good reason for that. Even though we listened to the community's feedback, we do need that washroom to be accessible from the parking lot for the truck to service it. So we didn't want to move it any further. If we moved it further north, it would also be right in the line of fire where the snow is going to be removed from. So it would make it even more difficult to service it. Another comment about the toilet was when we went to the public, we proposed only having one stall, wheelchair accessible. We thought we would do that because the feedback from our operations team of how much the porta potty is used. I don't want to let you know how much, but they've told us that we could get away with one stall. But council had already approved a 2-stall vault toilet, so we need to go ahead with installing what was approved. And what we may do, we're thinking that we can close off one side. It would be fully functional as a toilet, but we can lock that off and potentially use it for storage for the sports groups that will use the area. And as need changes and increases, we can open it up as a full toilet. So to allow for these changes, unfortunately, there will be trees that are impacted. So if you were to go to the site and walk about halfway through and look north, and you'd be standing north of the current rink, you would see these 4 large trees that are highlighted by the red arrows. Those 4 trees would need to come out to allow for the rink to be moved 10 meters to the north. As well as the tree that's on the farthest on the left, that's actually a stand of about, I think it was 12 or 14 smaller trees. That stand would also need to come out to allow for the rink to be moved. From this point, if you were to turn to the west and walk about 5 meters, and then look back down south, you would see this stand of trees. It's approximately 15 trees in total, and some of those are not even higher than my knees, but those would also need to come out to allow for the rink to be moved towards the west. And then if you continue further south, back towards the parking lot and back towards the original rink, you would see, well, you wouldn't see it now, hopefully it's gone, but where this mark on the snow is, when you look south, any tree that was within that mark to the left, those are the trees that would need to come out to allow for additional parking spaces. And we counted that would be about 12 mature trees that would need to come out. Now, if we pulled that back again to 7 parking stalls, we could probably get away with not taking any of these out. And so that concludes the presentation I have for you. If you have any questions.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Just on that last thought, what is it that's informing the size of the parking area other than space available? I mean, is there
We've done a few trips down to see how many vehicles are there. One difficult thing is that when you go in the daytime, you'll probably see no one there. The rink, when the ice was there, is mostly used in the evening. So we went by just a few visits as well as neighborhood comments of how many vehicles are there. I think the parks group would tell you that there's probably sufficient parking, and the neighbors would maybe say something different. So we're trying to find a compromise between the two without taking out excessive trees.
So the second plan that you move forward with, there's 3 additional parking stalls.
Mm-hmm.
Councilor McCallum?
Your Worship, to that question, and thank you for your presentation, it was excellent. Would we have the ability for a bit of a wait and see approach on the parking? This isn't going to be asphalt parking, I'm guessing it's gravel parking?
Initially, no, it'll just be gravel.
Gravel parking. So I'm wondering if, and I understand that this is a presentation of the consultation, this isn't an approval, and I understand that. I'm just wondering, from a project perspective, is it possible to consider not taking those trees out and seeing if the 7 stalls are actually enough, and then if we get continued feedback from that neighborhood, consider taking those other stands of trees out to accommodate those 3 extra spaces?
I think that's a good suggestion, and since my manager is out of the country, I'm going to say I don't see why we couldn't.
All right. She's got the hang of it here, huh?
We've also actually discussed doing the same thing for the pathways, and we've gone back and forth whether or not we should allow the neighborhood to create the pathways, wait a season or 2 and see where they develop.
Well, that was my next question. Do these pathways align with desire lines, these goat trails that you speak of? Because that's at the end of the day, and we see it all over Canmore, right? Where we put pathways in and then the desire lines actually show up.
Somewhat
and
differently.
Then you feel like you've made the wrong call based on literally mind reading. I don't see why
We've gone back several times back and forth whether we should make those gravel pathways now or wait a season or 2. So I think waiting for the parking is something that we could do as well.
Yeah,
we have the 7.
It's just a suggestion. And I had a question. Will there be garbage and recycling receptacles there?
So are there?
Will there be? Well, I'm guessing there are now.
There are now, and they will stay,
okay.
as well as a dog bag dispenser.
Yay.
Yep. Those will definitely stay there, and the picnic tables.
Did you say a dog dispenser?
A dog
bag
dispenser. Perfect. And so the concrete, will it be somewhat polished?
It will be.
Will roller skating be able to occur?
Oh, listen there.
Roller derby, I know roller derby had approached the Parks Department and asked about that. We're not planning to put the lines on the rink.
I don't think the lines are necessarily, well, I can't speak for roller derby. I can speak for a herd of 12-year-old girls that want to roller skate in the summertime.
So I believe it's going to be considered the summer home of the Pickleball Association. They're sort of going to move from Lions, and this will be more of their permanent space. But it'll also be a drop-in facility. So unless it's the evenings that they have it booked out, then whoever arrives first will be able to use it. And that could be ball hockey or the basketball or roller
It's my
skates.
recollection that the lines that you need to put on, like when they've done it at the rec center in Banff and Canmore, and I happen to be a volunteer with the roller derby group, that they just would put the lines in with tape and then rip them up at the end. It was no major biggie. So
it will be a smooth surface.
Excellent. That's great.
And the one thing that we've cautioned the pickleballers is how smooth it would be, and just they need to be cautious when they're running back and forth.
Yeah, for sure.
And to sweep the surface for dust, that will make it even slipperier.
No, that's great. Anyways, those were, and you said the basketball nets were going to go back up again?
They will.
Perfect.
The basketball nets are going to go in direction, right now we're planning from east to west. So when they're there, I believe it'll be 2, maybe even potentially 3 of the pickleball courts will still be accessible to those players as well.
Oh, good.
They'll just have to cooperate with the balls flying out.
Excellent. Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thanks.
Councillor Sanford, did you have a question?
I did. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned that the gazebo access was going to be important. So what is going to be the gazebo access to this site?
The gazebo, we're not planning right now. It was provided in your report, though, if it's something that council would like to approve.
But I mean, the rink has to be accessible.
Oh, sorry, Zamboni.
Oh, Zamboni, yes.
Zamboni.
The word I'm looking for is Zamboni.
So the Zamboni.
Yeah.
Gazebo, Zamboni.
Yeah.
I see the confusion.
That's hockey lingo. Yes.
So there's going to be
Zamboni.
There's going to be two equipment accesses on the north and the south end. Primarily, it'll access the rink through the south, but should there be an incident where, you know, a gate isn't functioning properly, they can also go around and they can get in from the north.
So are they going up through the parking lot? Is that
Yes.
how the Zamboni's going to get in there? Or because it's not going to go between the houses?
No.
That's not accessible.
No,
Right?
the scale there, that pathway is 1.5 meters wide.
Okay.
So they wouldn't be able to get through there.
And then how are they going to flood that little kiddie rink, the seasonal kids rink?
So the faucet or the tap is the little purple star, and they just have a hose and they berm it, is how they do the kiddie rink. And so that means they can also move it around from season to season if need be. They
berm it with
soil and snow,
okay.
I believe.
So they're not just going to put snowbanks around it? Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. You also mentioned that there were some pathways by the houses that they wanted removed.
Well, some of the comments we heard, and we had to tell the public that we weren't working on the housing development, but some of the comments back were that they did not like that there was pathways, the two that come through off of 11th Avenue. So that's what we have, the plan that we've been working with, so that's why we've picked it up. But some of the comments we heard back were that they didn't want that they'd rather that it came from the north or from the south.
So that's the new housing that didn't want the pathway through the housing
Potential new occupants of the housing
Okay.
would be some of the people we heard those comments from.
So those are just laneways then. The houses are sort of offset from that. It's a narrow pathway, but the houses aren't.
It's a narrow pathway. On 11th, the access, the vehicles are on the front side on 11th, and on 17th Street, the cars come in on the back side, so they're on the north side of the houses there. And one comment I should make, that we are planning to install a little gate from our parking lot so that people who are using our facility can't then access 11th by going behind the houses. We want to keep them off there. And the gate will only be accessible to the fire department for emergencies.
Okay, that's all the questions I had. Thank you.
And just for the record, those pathways off 11th were quite intentional, and it's to allow for easier access from the Woodlands residents through to the park. Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Ms. Bernard, for the presentation. It's really excellent and nice to hear so much feedback from the community and things. Just always concerned about trees, and you want to move it north and west. Looks like a lot of the trees are going to be, the ones that are disappearing aren't really that impactful. Looks like north, there's still good buffers between the houses there.
Yes, my personal opinion, I would agree with you.
And moving it west, it looks like the trees that we're losing won't be very mature trees.
They're fairly young.
And one of the comments I heard was the entrance. They were concerned, the residents that are living at the entrance of the arena, they were worried about that expanding and losing those mature trees. And by the 10 additional stalls, it looks like they'll be moved from the inside, not on the outside. So the entrance trees will be more or less saved, or am I not looking at that properly?
The entrance from 17th?
Yes.
Those would be the ones that would be impacted, the dozen or so that are mature trees, to allow for the 3 additional parking stalls.
So they'll lose those buffer trees then?
They would.
But if administration decides to go slowly and just start with 7-stall parking lot and wait and see, it may be that you decide not to have the extra space and leave those trees.
So why can you not put parking stalls more north?
Let's see, I'll go back to this diagram. If we went further north, that's also where snow would be removed from, so it would be double handling snow. And then the other comment is that the water faucet is in the way. And then we would also have to move the vault toilet further north as well, so that would move it up into the snow removal area as well.
So I guess I'd be in favor of moving slowly and hoping that the 7 parking stalls would be enough.
Mm-hmm.
And if not, then maybe those mature trees can be considered. We can carefully go and maybe creatively create 3 more stalls without removing a lot of those mature
Right.
trees. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I just had one brief question around the rink lighting. I just assume that it's shielded or some, so is the rink lighting shielded so it's not creating glare for Juniper in particular?
It's the rink lighting that's currently there, it's projected downwards, but for anyone who's gone by in the evening, it's pretty visible from a few blocks away. So the budget that's been approved does include new lighting, and the lighting that we're looked at is a bit higher tech, and it shouldn't have as much glare off of the rink area as it does now. And then the other comment I can make is that during the winter season, the lights go off at 10 p.m., which I suppose if you have children trying to sleep, that's probably still quite late, but it's also something that I understand we can be a bit flexible with the Parks Department. But then if we do that for the residents, there'll be complaints from the users that they're losing valuable rink time.
Well, in the summer here is still daylight at 10, so it won't matter that much.
Exactly.
Are there any other questions this time for Ms. Bernard? Seeing none, thanks very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Good information.
Thanks.
Then I'll move on then to item G2, 2026 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games bid. Ms. DeSoto.
Thank you, Mayor Barrowman, members of council. I'm here this evening to discuss with you the consideration of an invitation from the City of Calgary to participate in the bid corporation that will be established to explore the bid for the 2026 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games. I'm sure most of you by now are aware, although maybe Councillor McCallum, having just arrived and not up to speed on the news lately, but are aware of the Thursday announcement from the federal and provincial government that they have committed funding towards a bid corporation. So with that announcement came out after this package, this agenda package was prepared. So the staff report that was prepared anticipated a potential conditional recommendation. So there was the 2 recommendations in the staff report. Just to start with that, I have a few proposed edits based on the new information regarding funding commitment, and also in just some reconsideration of the actual request from the City of Calgary, which asks that council nominate a director. So the first recommendation is just to that council approve the town of Canmore's participation in a bid corporation established by the City of Calgary for the purpose of exploring a bid for the 2026 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games, and then let council nominate the CAO as the town of Canmore representative on the bidco, and then authorize myself to exercise the powers and voting rights associated with the town's membership interest in the bidco. And that's the same wording that the City of Calgary used for their nominated appointee to the bidco. So I just thought I would start with that, and then move into what the proposed bidco structure and membership would be, walk you through the attachment to the City of Calgary's invitation, which outlined that there are 6 core members of the bidco. The bidco would be incorporated as a not-for-profit under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, and they had looked at a number of different acts to incorporate it under, but the CNCA was the one they selected. As I mentioned, there would be 6 members. The City of Calgary, the Canadian Olympic Committee, the Government of Canada, and the Government of Alberta make up the main 4 core members, followed with the Canadian Paralympic Committee and the Town of Canmore as the other 2 members. From those 6 members, there would be 19 directors, and the recommendation is that they be non-elected representatives of those organizations. So each government entity is being requested to nominate a senior government official, again, a non-elected official, and then those who have more than 1 director as their membership criteria would propose potential representatives from Indigenous peoples, community leaders, business leaders, and sport leaders. So it's hopeful, my hope is that there may be opportunity for the Town of Canmore, although we have 1 formal director appointment to the board, that there would be opportunity in the selection of the 5 at-large directors. Sorry, I hadn't mentioned those. There are 5 at-large directors, 1 who would be the chair and 2 who would be representatives of Indigenous people. But there are also other potential at-large directors, and it's my hope that we'd be able to have some influence in having included representation from the Bow Valley, either from sport or business leaders here. Maybe before I move off that slide, are there any questions on the structure or membership?
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. I was curious, in the attachment that's provided with regards to the structure, it's headed as proposed structure. And so I'm wondering who was responsible for creating this structure, and who was responsible for approving the structure, and or is it not approved? Is it sort of suggested at this point, and then everybody puts forward who they, from the communities and governments, other orders of government, put forward their names, and then it's sort of confirmed through that group? How is that going to?
Yeah, no, that all good questions. My current understanding, well, firstly, there was no consultation with the Town of Canmore about the governance structure. The governance structure was discussed at length, I understand, between the city, the Government of Alberta, the Government of Canada, and the Canadian Olympic Committee, the 4 core members. The 3 levels of government there, the city, the GOA, and GOC, are the major funding partners. And there is no bid without the Canadian Olympic Committee at the table as well. In past bids, in fact, the lion's share of the board have been occupied by Canadian Olympic Committee members. So this is it took quite a bit of negotiation with the Canadian Olympic Committee to have them only have 3 seats. The proposed structure is, my understanding, it's what's agreed to those core funding partners for the BidCo. And then I'll get into what the BidCo work is proposed to be. And part of the BidCo work is to look at the policies and the government structure and get those incorporating documents all approved through the board. So that will be the initial work of the BidCo.
So can you go back to the original page? I'm sorry. So the directors, will the directors be the ones that choose who the Indigenous peoples, the community leaders, will they be the core group to choose the remainder of the members of the BidCo? Again, it's not crystal clear in the document, and that came in quite late last week, so I believe it was Tuesday or Wednesday last week that we got a look at that BidCo governance structure. So we haven't had a lot of dialogue with the City of Calgary on their intent for that. We are being asked, so the at-large directors for certain would be selected by the members. Again, the city has only appointed their deputy CAO to
the board. They're currently collecting names of other potential nominees, and my understanding is they would put those names forward to the rest of the group, and there would be but the city would get to put forward, say, 4 or 5 names, and then 2 would be selected by the group to represent the city's directors.
And this is going to sound really naive. Is there a reason why there's inequality between the Canadian Olympic Committee and the Canadian Paralympic Committee in terms of members? One is allowed 1 member and the other is allowed 3 between.
So this entire process is an IOC process, and the IOC does not govern the Paralympics. The Paralympics are governed by a completely separate, the International Paralympic Association. So the process of getting the bid that's required to be submitted in January of 2019 is the bid to host the Olympic Games. The Paralympics
is a separate set of games. So that doesn't really have, it's not part of this bid?
Well, it is. They've, over the years, they've merged together. When the Olympics were held in '88, for example, the Paralympics were not hosted at the same time. So it's just been sort of in recent history that they've amalgamated, and the bid is submitted jointly. But that's a very good question. I just know the timeline and the process to date has been set by the IOC, and so I believe that's why it's the Canadian Olympic Committee that's got those.
All right. Thank you.
Chairs. Okay, so moving on then, before, there have been some questions about the work of the BidCo and what the motions, if passed, if council chooses to authorize participation, what that would mean. So I want to be clear that approval to participate in the BidCo at this time does not mean approval to bid, and the city has made that clear in their approvals as well to date. So the work of the BidCo, the first formation from April almost through to June is really about hiring and getting members appointed and establishing policies and governance structure. That will take a good several months to do. In the meantime, there's a parallel process that the city is continuing on in development of the bid. And at some point that transitions completely over to the BidCo, and hopefully as seamlessly as possible. So the refined gains concept and budget is underway. It's currently underway. It's been underway for a few months, but when that will actually complete, I'm not certain. There's also a release of a host city contract that the IOC makes available sometime in the next couple of months, and there's a process of review of that host city contract with the IOC, and I'm told by the end of June there should be clear requirements, guarantees, and commitments that are understood as part of that host city contract. And then coincident with that, there will be the negotiation of the multi-party agreement between all the BidCo members, and that really gets to who pays for what and what are the obligations of each member. So we would need to have clear representation at that table in order to understand what the expectations are from the town of Canmore in that regard. And then lastly, the IOC's invitation to approved candidate cities to bid is set for September. So again, the current understanding that I have is between now and September is the timeline, and probably given how late in the game we are, closer to September, I imagine, that there will be a formal request to Town Council to authorize us to participate in the bid.
So I'm sorry, so September is when the IOC will
invite candidate cities to bid.
And if you're not invited in September, that's that.
That's that.
And not everybody necessarily that's indicating an interest would be invited.
That's what I understand. So that's a good segue. Earlier today, this morning in fact, the IOC announced that there's 7 official cities that have expressed interest, official interest in hosting the 2026 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games. When we were in Pyeongchang, Mayor Barman, you'll know that there were only 3 other cities there. The 3 others that were in Pyeongchang with us was Sapporo, Japan, Stockholm, Sweden, and Sion, Switzerland. Since that time, and there was a March 31st deadline to declare your official interest status. So since that time, there's been an election in Italy, and Milan and Turin are joining forces to submit a joint bid, or have interest in submitting a bid. There's another interested bid from Austria and Turkey as well. So I don't know the quality of those interests currently.
Do you have a question?
I do. You're just going to leave me on permanently, aren't you?
This gizmo isn't working all that well these days.
I thought that going to the observer program was a requirement of actually bidding.
It was considered an essential element of the bid.
The words that were used in the press and in this chamber was a requirement.
No, we were actually quite clear that it was not a mandatory requirement. It was an essential component of the bid process. There was some early publication that said it was mandatory, but then the city made it clear that the IOC was not making it a mandatory component. The IOC did put on a full knowledge transfer program, as you're aware, and was shared with council. And so again, the value of a bid, I think what this shows is that it is a competitive landscape. There are potentially more countries interested in hosting the Olympics under the revised vision that the IOC has stated. And so how the IOC will view a bid from a candidate city that didn't participate in the Pyeongchang Olympics is anybody's guess, I guess.
Thank you.
So moving on then, just to talk a bit about bid co-funding and commitments. Again, I wanted to be clear, the report does make it clear that there's no expectation of funding support from the town of Canmore. In the short term, my secondment, should you approve that motion, or not secondment, because it's not a secondment, my nomination to the board, in the short term, between now and sort of a declaration to officially bid is what I'm expecting. I would be able to manage that workload. There's a potential that I would have to start reducing some of my normal commitments at the town of Canmore, and if that should occur, or when that occurs, as we proceed, we do anticipate that there will be additional resources needed, but we would bring a report back to council for approval of those additional resources. So the funding for the BidCo work itself is to be shared by the 3 funding partners of the City of Calgary, the Government of Canada, and the Government of Alberta. And their funding split is noted on the slide and in the report. And I should note the City of Calgary's funding of $9.5 million includes funds already spent and committed by the city. And they just recently released the last $2.5 million at a decision last week, I believe it was. So the interesting thing, and I said I would come back to this, that was announced last Thursday as part of the provincial announcement on their funding commitment, was that it would be conditional on meaningful and robust public engagement that included the requirement for a plebiscite. And so that was a bit of a surprise to us, in all honesty. And throughout the engagement we've done to date, we've been making it clear that a decision to participate in a bid would be made by council, considering all aspects of community input and all other considerations that you would take into account, be they financial, social, environmental, etc. So we certainly need to understand more about the scope of a plebiscite and what our role might be, or what the province expects our role would be, and we've had no conversations with the province to date. But I did think it would be helpful just to review again quickly what our public engagement to date has been. We've done a phase 1 engagement where we asked the community to identify priorities and concerns, and then we reflected those values, priorities, and concerns into a set of principles, which we shared with Council at Committee of the Whole last month. And we're currently in the process of a phase 2 evaluation on those principles, back out with survey, stakeholder meetings, and open houses with the public to have them weigh in on the principles. We intend to bring sort of merge the community's input with some work that Council did independently as part of your strategic planning and bring that to you in May. But just the draft principles are lengthy and there's 13 of them, so I've just sort of highlighted some of the key words and phrases coming out of those principles. You know, just making decisions that align with our identity and values, committing to sharing information, ensuring the town is a recognized partner, considering livability and affordability as areas of focus, minimizing financial exposure for the town, ensuring that we can be showcased as a leader in environmental stewardship, focusing on lasting legacies and having those legacies support wildlife, transportation, sport, and infrastructure. Considering inclusivity and accessibility in games delivery, targeting opportunities to diversify our economy, ensuring that we're moving towards Council's identified strategic priorities through delivery of the games, leveraging our reputation for clean and ethical sport, and collaboration with First Nations neighbors, residents, and lastly, inspiring greatness to bring about our collective best. So just in summary, the BIDCO participation in the BIDCO and appointment of a senior representative of the town will ensure that we have access to timely and up-to-date information, which has been a struggle to date, in all honesty, that there's a way for the town of Canmore to put a lens on any decision-making process and potentially the ability to influence the decisions that come forward and ensure that the guiding principles that the community and council set for us are at least part of the discussion at the table. So with that, the recommendations that I have, these are the revised ones with the edits in them, and I'd be happy to answer any additional questions that you may have.
Thank you for the report. I have a question from the proposed structure, attachment 1 that was provided by the city, I guess.
Yes.
And it talks about the BIDCO Advisory Committee. And I don't understand. It's not clear to me how that advisory committee, the members of that committee would be appointed. Have you had any conversation?
No, I've had no conversations. In one presentation to the town of Canmore, this was actually quite some time ago at the beginning of January, a team from City of Calgary and Min came out, including the lawyer they had drafting the BIDCO structure, and there was some suggestion that the advisory committee could be upwards of a couple of hundred people. So there might be specialty subcommittees on the advisory group that would advise on specific topics. But again, how that would be formed and used, yeah, it's
so
not
your
clear.
Expectation is that would be planned or defined once the BIDCO board is in place? The board would decide how to go about. I see.
Gathering nominations,
right.
Setting those up, yes.
And with the September deadline, best case scenario, when's the BIDCO board start work at this point?
So the timeline is fluid. My understanding is that there are some recruitment firms that have been retained to try to recruit for some of the C-suite type positions, the CEO, the CFO, you know, some of the staff positions. There's also recruitment firms being engaged to recruit nationally, potentially internationally, for the chair, which is one of the members at large, or directors at large. And so that work is underway, and hoping that those key positions potentially could be in place by the end of the month. Until those key positions of chair and CEO and chief financial officer, et cetera, are secured, not much work can get underway.
That's the end of April. And then it takes the BIDCO board some time to get things figured out. Presumably, they would then fairly quickly agree what the composition might look like of an advisory committee and start reaching out. I mean, as you say, it suggests a lot of people on the advisory committee, and that's certainly one place where the town of Canmore could have significant additional input, albeit not controlling input. But it's the September IOC deadline that I'm confused or puzzled about. So it's April, it'll be the end of April, it'll be sometime in May before BIDCO and the advisory committee are actually starting to work. That's June, July, August. At that point, the commitment is only that, correct me if I'm wrong, in September, the commitment is only that we would be interested in submitting a bid at another time.
So I don't have all of the answers, and from my perspective, the question of a plebiscite has put a really big
that's partly where I was
question mark into the time frame. So the City of Calgary is set to bring a report to their council April 10th. They are currently researching the requirements for a plebiscite, the expectations of questions. My connections with folks over the weekend, given that it was Easter, was minimal and was just limited to a few emails. But at minimum, it would take 6 months to establish the plebiscite requirement. So we're looking into the fall, which is likely past the September deadline. So how that influences the IOC's decision to select Calgary as a candidate city with a potential plebiscite still undetermined.
So what I'm trying to understand is if there could be interest expressed in September through the work of the BIDCO, that 5-6 months later the city or the BIDCO or whoever would withdraw. I mean, so once you've committed, if this September is a commitment deadline, what happens if the city or the bidding group backs out after September?
Yeah. So the announcement last Thursday of the requirement for a plebiscite, I think, has likely changed the whole thinking behind when the city and the town of Canmore and others would fully commit to a bid. I don't see how any government organization fully commits to a bid until there's a plebiscite held, if in fact one goes forward. So that would likely now mean after the deadline for the IOC to nominate or announce candidate cities. So how that all works, I know there's ongoing dialogue with the IOC. This is one of the reasons why I think it's really important that we participate and be at the table, because right now we're just not part of those discussions. Sure.
Still on the plebiscite question, which I know nobody really understands, but it's understood that Minister of Tourism, at least, expects that it's mandatory the City of Calgary conduct a plebiscite. He hasn't included the town of Canmore, so it's not mandatory as far as information from the minister. The question council will have to discuss sometime soon is whether the town of Canmore, whether we'll conduct a plebiscite as well. And I'm not sure if we're going to do that.
Well, as I said in the presentation, all of our work to date has made it clear to the public that we were not going to go to the public with a yes or no question. that council would be the deciding, the group that would decide if the town was going to bid, and you would take all the information collected through public engagement and other means to make that decision.
From that to that point, a plebiscite is another form of information. I mean, it's another information gathering tool by which council can ultimately make a decision. You know, plebiscite isn't binding. Clearly, a plebiscite, the response is heavily weighted one way or the other, is going to be binding in a certain way. But I mean, if we were to decide we would follow suit with the city and hold a plebiscite, or if the province says the town of Canmore, or perhaps the province will say the whole province has to conduct a plebiscite. I mean, it doesn't change the fact, in my opinion, that ultimately it'll be council that'll decide yes or no on pursuing partnership in a bid.
And correct. So if council would like administration to investigate and research conducting a plebiscite, that hasn't been something we've considered doing, and it's certainly something we can explore and discuss as we move forward and understand through further dialogue with the other levels of government what the exact expectations are. I do know that, for example, prior to the Vancouver Whistler Games, the city of Vancouver held a plebiscite, but the resort municipality of Whistler did not.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's...
At this point, we don't know.
We don't know.
But we do know that there's some fairly tight timelines being discussed. So we do know we want to be as ready as we can be for anything that comes along.
Correct.
So I do think it's worth at least putting together some sort of off the side of your desk, some thoughts about that to discuss.
Well, you know, the city has indicated to me that they will share all of the information and research that they've done. But they haven't presented that to council yet. That's proposed to go to council, their city council, April 10th. So once they've got that available for public dissemination, they would share that with us and all the background information as well.
I mean, that has budgetary impact as well, of course. You've said quite clearly that you feel it's critical for the town to be involved in the BIDCO, and frankly, I agree with that. But what we haven't explored or understood is what's the impact, or what's it look like if the town, for some reason, decided not to be a partner in the BIDCO. I mean, I doubt if that would stop the process in its tracks. So if council decided to not support being involved with the BIDCO, my expectation is that the city and the province and the COC would continue forward with the BIDCO, and we simply wouldn't have a voice there. Is that accurate?
I was wondering if that was a question. Finished
with the question.
I would say that we have constantly been told that we're a key partner, and if you look at the formation of the BIDCO, no other community is, other than the city of Calgary, is proposed to have a director appointed to the BIDCO. So there's no director from Whistler or Edmonton or any other potential community that could host some of the events. So Canmore as a mountain host community is really important. I think if we didn't participate in the bid, it potentially could send a message that the city might want to look elsewhere for the Nordic events to occur, the cross-country and biathlon events, and it wouldn't be beyond plausibility for them to consider Whistler, for example, where currently there's consideration to host the ski jumps and Nordic combined events in Whistler. So adding the cross-country and biathlon events there could be a possibility.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. Along those same lines, I'm just wondering if you have any sense of during the BIDCO process that they will be looking at alternatives to Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, because they have to table a bid that encompasses all the requirements for an Olympic event, correct? So Canmore has options of proceeding, but if Canmore doesn't proceed, then they must have some sort of concept of how they're going to back it up, whether it's Whistler or even hosting some of the events in arenas. You know, if Calgary gets an arena, that's one thing, but if the finances don't add up to that, then they have to host certain things in certain facilities, correct?
They absolutely have to host, yes. And there are a number of Plan Bs and Plan Cs for a number of venues. Although I have not been told of any Plan B for the cross-country or biathlon events. The current full-on concept is the Canmore Nordic Centre. Similarly, there isn't, to my knowledge, a Plan B for some of the alpine events that would be hosted at Nikiska, for example. It is full expectation that the events that are proposed for Nikiska would be able to go there. And so some, where there's new facilities proposed, there are some Plan Bs, or where there's some question marks about the suitability of some facilities. For example, Lake Louise, I know they're looking at a number of different options for the speed events of the alpine venues.
So ultimately, the bid package has to have agreements in place. Everybody has to be very clear on what their obligations are, and that's what they would submit for a bid, potentially.
Yes.
But we would have to essentially know what those criteria are for every aspect of the bid. And I guess it would be confidential, though, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah, that's the interesting thing. It is a competition, and typically much of what is in the bid package is protected as what's the word I'm looking for? Proprietary to the bid. However, there's some indication that there's desire to release as much as possible in advance of a plebiscite, so that the community or the those who would be voting have information to inform their opinion and vote. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure how that will all work in releasing information. Certainly the cost data is one that they are suggesting would be released in advance.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. So it's my understanding, Ms. DeSoto, that when Whistler had, or Vancouver had their plebiscite, that they actually had the bid organized. It was a post, like they had their bid book organized. It wasn't submitted yet, but that was what the pleb was based on, was the numbers that were found in that document. Is that?
Well, I know the plebiscite date was in 2003, so that was seven. It was quite late in the process, so that would make sense. Mm-hmm. Because, yeah, the bid is usually awarded, or the host city is awarded about 7 years before.
Right.
So the games were in 2010, and their plebiscite was in 2003.
So the parallel processes that the city of Calgary is going through is that if they have to have this pleb, they need to have they want to have an educated pleb.
Yes.
And so that's why they're rushing to get this bidco organized, I'm guessing.
Well, the bidco, I mean, many folks feel it's actually really late to the game.
Yeah, I guess I just thought we would have a bit more time to talk about this than 4 days before getting a document, 4 days before we had to make a decision. So that's what's kind of surprising to me. I thought that we would have actually had an opportunity to go and complete our community engagement prior to doing that, and so that's why I'm a little surprised. But I just wanted to know if you had the same understanding about that. Do you happen to know if the city of Calgary has discussed at all having a committee of council?
I don't know.
Specific to the Olympics?
No, I don't know if that's been a discussion at Calgary Council.
Because I think that might be something that our council might want to consider. Knowing that you would report to a full council and there would be reports, but to having more regular updates amongst council themselves. And it's just a suggestion. I don't know what other people think. And do you happen to know, I know that the IOC managed to take some time, and when they were visiting the various facilities in Calgary, they took the time to have a lunch and learn or some sort of meeting with Calgary Council. Do you know if there is any intention of the IOC coming to Canmore and providing us with the same courtesy?
I do not know.
Okay.
So the IOC has been back a second time, and I think is scheduled to be back a third time. It's administrative folks that come for the most part. So it's certainly something that could be asked.
It's just an opportunity, because we are asking you a lot of questions which you don't have all the answers to, and a lot of those answers sit in the mind of the IOC. I'd like to understand how they're going to address doping going forward. I'd like to understand how they're going to address sexual misconduct going forward within their associate organizations. And that's not a fair question to ask you. That's a fair question to ask them.
Right.
And if we're going to play host to this kind of event, those are questions I'd like to ask. So I just was wondering if they were ever planning on coming to see us.
Yeah. So currently, there has been no request to have the IOC come to Canmore. When they did come the first time in January, there was a suggestion that they know the Canmore Nordic Centre very well. I mean, they were focused on venues. And what I hear you talking about is more community, philosophy, and social concerns.
Well, I think those were the questions that were asked from the councillors that were part of those meetings. They were given a week's notice, from what I'm told.
Yeah, and those meetings were held behind closed doors,
Yeah.
so I'm not sure what was
Yeah.
asked. Yeah.
Thank you.
So just to follow up on your suggestion, when you're suggesting a committee of council, what do you have in mind in terms of the work assigned, or what would you see that, how would you see that function?
I'm not 100% sure, Your Worship. I'm kind of looking for the in-between, between having what feels like very little information and very little control to having the full meal deal. I'm just trying to find something that's reasonable in the middle. And so...
So let me...
So sort of like we have a finance committee, right? Something, I guess...
finance committee, of course, is all of council, and I'm wondering if your desire would be met by having more regular, short meetings of council, like all of council. I mean, if there's a committee of council,
it should be all of
that's
council.
going to add to the workload for the CAO if she's appointed to the BIDCO, and then that committee is going to beat things around, and then have to get this whole group together, and it's starting to be inefficient, perhaps. But maybe it's just something we can talk about.
Yeah,
later
I think
on.
it's worth discussing. Like, I think that
Yeah,
there's going to be a level of accountability here that's required, and
what I hear is you want more access, better access to information, quicker access to information, and I think that's reasonable.
well, and they short of going to the City of Calgary website, that's pretty much.
Which doesn't have much on it, sorry.
It doesn't have, it has more than I expected, to be honest, but like I know councillors have stacks and stacks of papers and binders sitting in their offices in Calgary, and we don't. And we talk about being a full and equal partner. Well, that's part of being an equal partner, and I don't feel very equal. The mayor of Calgary didn't even know that we had a member of staff seconded to the snow sports, and that was quite embarrassing. Quite frankly, and that was publicly announced in a council meeting last week. So
that's problematic. And that's not your fault. That's not our fault. That's just, we got to elbow our way in. But we also realize our capacity as a small town. My other concern is the fact that we're not being asked, I know this sounds kind of silly, we're not being asked to commit money, but then we have no skin in the game. So what is our leverage in terms of asking and having a voice and being representative? Another member of council was asking questions about what our skin in the game was, and that's when it came out that the mayor had no idea that we had someone seconded. So I just think, those are things concern me.
When I think about that question, the skin in the game, if you will, is if ultimately the plan sees the Nordic sports happening in Canmore, they have to have the town of Canmore's support. That's the skin in the game. I mean, if we were not supportive, I don't see that the whole game would move forward. Short of finding a different location, it's not so much the venue, it's all of the peripheral infrastructural needs, an Olympic Village, an Athletes Village, and all of those other bits and pieces that will be required, likely, almost certainly outside of the Nordic Center. And if council is not supportive and doesn't give land use approvals for things like athletes' villages and all. I mean, I've been told directly by one of the main city person that Canmore's involvement is critical and important. I hear what you're saying about sharing of information. My understanding is a lot of what the council, the city is sharing with their councillors is, I don't know, uber confidential or borderline confidential.
Or they're not getting it. That's what my conversations with councillors are, they're not getting it.
They're not getting the
They're not getting information. So.
Yeah, and I think what I've reported to date is that the process the city's been going through has been very city-centric, and the move to a bidco is good because it brings in all the players under one umbrella and the same organizational structure, so we all have equal footing. Right now, it's been the city's process, and you know, they've been very intentional on saying, this is our decision, right? So they're trying to make up their minds, and yeah.
Yeah, it's been stated regularly for, well, I don't know if a year, but a long time, that there should be a bidco in place. The way this bid is being built up with the city leading it has been flawed.
Well, but I think that, and this is more conversational, and I apologize if this isn't appropriate, but I know that, like, I guess I understood that the CBEC process was going to be the informing process that the City of Calgary, should they have decided to have a pleb, would have made the decision. It wasn't until about 2 days into my holiday, when I was surfing the internet, that I realized that the City of Vancouver had their pleb after their bid book had been prepared, not submitted, but prepared, because those numbers were the numbers that they wanted to file their pleb, or to perform their pleb on. And that makes sense to me. Like, logically, that makes sense. You want people to make decisions with information, but at the same time, that's a $30 million exploration in addition to the CBEC process that's already occurred, which I thought would have provided us with, the royal us, with a lot more information than we got. And again, that is not the fault of anyone in this building. That's just, I think, like, you know, like the contract, the host city contract was meant to be out the middle of this month, according to the timelines that are provided on the City of Calgary website, that in a document that was filed 10 days ago. So I just, it's, I'm losing faith. And I am worried about, yeah, I'll save that for debate.
Okay. In that case, I'll see if there's any other questions from members of council for Ms. DeSoto. Seeing none. Okay.
How many hours do you think you will be spending on a monthly basis with regards to the bidco?
Yeah, and I have no idea. There is some suggestion, I think, in the letter or in the bidco structure, that there would be an orientation and an expectation of board directors that would be provided, and that has yet to be provided. So there is reference to it being an intensive 18-month period. I have had discussions with the former CAO in Whistler, and he suggested that during the bidco phase, he was able to manage most of the workload. It wasn't until the bid was awarded to the City of Vancouver and the Resort Municipality of Whistler that the work really ramps up in planning and hosting, organizing all the live sites and celebration sites, etc. So
That's if it's awarded.
that's if it's awarded,
It's awarded.
right? So between now and award, because it's such a compressed timeline, and I'm expecting it to be greater than what they experienced in Whistler. But yeah, exactly what that would look like, I'm not sure.
Yeah, we've just gone through strategic planning.
Okay, if there's no further questions, then.
None.
And I don't see any. Thanks for your presentation. Good conversation. Complicated bit of business. So at this time, I will move the council approve the town of Canmore's participation in a bid corporation, bidco, established by the City of Calgary for the purpose of exploring a bid for the 2026 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games. You want, I think that's two separate motions. That's the motion. The first paragraph on the overhead is the motion right now on the floor. I'll speak to the motion, and I will support having the town participate in the bidco. It's pretty much, if we're not at the table, and we've said this a number of times, we don't have a voice, we don't have any influence. And in all of our planning, we've talked about what there would be for the town of Canmore in the way of positive and understanding negative potential. And if we want to be able to have what we see as the positive potential strengthened through the bidco, we have to be there to have it on the table. And conversely, if we're concerned about various negative possibilities coming from co-hosting the games, then those should be taken to the bidco for discussion as well. There's marginally no financial commitment at this point from the town over and above what we've already approved. There's, there comes a decision point where we will have to decide as a council whether we will move forward fully as a partner in the games, as a co-host. But that's not upon us yet. I think this is one really significant way of getting more information. To Councillor McCallum's point, we have a lot of questions, we want a lot of information. This would be one very good way of doing that. So I will support the motion. And I look to other councillors for discussion. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think that supporting the bidco is an opportunity for us to determine what would benefit us through this process. And I don't want to see us get marginalized through this process. So I think our participation at this level is really critical at this time, because what we have to gain and the challenges that it would pose for us would be better understood. I also think that we're in the process of community engagement right now, and we identify with the Olympic concept. We sent over 20 Olympians to the Olympic Games in Pyeongchang just recently. I mean, we've benefited from the previous Olympics in '88. We've had intergenerational opportunities through that. So I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that we have a strong sense in this community that it is beneficial and of some value to us in the future. What we need to understand is what it means to our community. So the bidco process to us is that opportunity. And I see it important that we stay at the table and have that information available to us to make our decision in the long term. So I will support the bid process that we're being asked to participate in with the City of Calgary.
So the discussion from members of council. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. So when we talked about approving the $200,000 in December, I think I had made and articulated quite clearly that there were certain things that I needed to understand to be able to move forward. And those were around themes of our livability, the environment, economic diversification. And I expected that those things would come to the forefront before we would have to make a decision like this today. And I feel like a lot of the questions and the information that I was looking for that would be provided within this time period already, and it hasn't been. So this is my off-ramp point. I will not be able to support this motion. I really feel like our community engagement needs to be, this is very emotional, I'm sorry. I would really have liked to have seen the completion of our community engagement before we might had to be forced into this corner to make a decision on this. And I think that our engagement has been quite good and quite robust, but I feel like we owe it to our citizens to complete that before we make a decision like this. And everyone here is at the table over the last month in regards to our strategic planning. And we have a lot of dreams and promises that we made during the election. And I don't feel that sending our CAO away for 18 months is going to fulfill those dreams and those promises that we made to our citizens. And so with all due respect to all the work that's been done and the meetings and the emails and the phone calls and the stress, quite frankly, that has been experienced by administration, I unfortunately am not going to be able to support this motion. I do apologize.
Just in the spirit of debate, which this is, by being part of the BidCo, we're not committing to anything in the long run. I'm still waiting to hear information. I'm still waiting to gather information both through the BidCo and through our other processes. And I agree with you 100% that we need ultimately to have more robust information and feedback from our community. I've identified personally in conversations some of the positive benefits that I see coming from being a co-host. But those, I have no idea whether those benefits are going to play out in reality. So I have to know that before I'll support ultimately the final vote and moving forward. I see this as being an important step of getting to where we all want to get, which is better understanding before we actually commit to a full bid. So, in the spirit of the debate, Councillor Seeley, did you want to?
I could respond, but I feel like 4 months has been enough time.
Fair enough.
And we still have not received any inkling whatsoever from the provincial government as to what kind of commitments that they're going to make to us as a community personally so that we could even conceive of affording what our piece of this pie is going to be. And I just, there's just even the ethical side of it. I just don't see how continuing to head down this path is going to get us any more information than we've been getting in a shorter period of time. I agree that if we were gung-ho to do this, and that it would be important to be there, but I don't necessarily think everyone's gung-ho. And the only way we can know that for sure is to complete our community engagement. I think it's your job, Your Worship, to be a cheerleader for events like this, but we keep talking about the benefits, and then we talk about the possible detractors. And it's not just possible, it could very well happen. Just like the benefits are possible, they may not happen. And I feel like we're looking at this as a glass half full exercise, and it's just got water in it. That's all there is. There's just water in it. But in the spirit of debate, but I will let my colleagues speak. I don't see myself changing my mind. You know I have struggled with this for a very long time. I will continue to keep my mind open going forward, because I don't think that this is an emotion that's going to go in the direction that I'm going, but I can't continue along and not stand up. And today I'm standing up.
Fair enough, and I respect your position.
Thank you.
I'll
and I respect your decision.
Reiterate, though, that by staying involved, that's how we're going to get the information the community needs and we need.
Yeah,
so,
well, we haven't gotten anything so far.
I'm expecting that to change. Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I will support the BIDCO. A lot of the information I've heard tonight and I've heard along the way. We need more information. Being at the table and respecting the CAO's time, it's something that seems quite manageable right now. And it's an important opportunity. A lot of these questions will come out. We'll be able to get better information, timely information. I think it's very important to be at the table. It's not costing us anymore. We've already made that investment. So I see a lot of positives being at the table. So I will support the motion.
Councillor Comfort.
I too will support the motion. I understand and sympathize with Councillor McCallum on the lack of information and what may be pipe dreams in both directions, positive and negative. But I want to stay on board the train and get that information or more information. I'm, however, very much aware when I consider, you know, the Olympics that I'm familiar with, so 1976, 1988, Rio a little bit. It never turns out to be what it starts out as. You know, it's, and I don't think that's changed. So there's a lot of uncertainty going in. I am pleased that our CAO is prepared to give up her life a little bit for the next 6 months to enable us, to help us make this decision. That's how I see her role. I don't care what the City of Calgary thinks her role is or what the IOC thinks her role is. For me, her role is to serve the people of Canmore and to help this council make this decision. And I have faith that she will do that.
Councillor Mera.
Thank you, Your Worship. I also sympathize and agree with Councillor McCullum and understand her frustration, as I believe there's a lot of frustration around this issue with lack of information. But I will support this motion. I figure we have our toes in the water. We might as well put a whole foot in, and we've already agreed to spend some money to get some information, even though it's limited. But I agree it's best to have some information, and then we can make a decision once we have further down the road. And I too appreciate our CAO putting her time in, and she feels that she can control it for now with her continuing on with her responsibilities and her staff. So I will support this.
Councillor Hillstead.
Thank you, Your Worship. I agree with everyone with what they've said. It's all basically been covered. I think we do need to join into the BIDCO for now and get the information we're looking for. And if that information is not satisfactory, then it makes our lives a lot simpler. But right now, because we have such a lack of information, it's making it a lot more complicated. But I feel this is a good way to get that information we need. So I will support this motion.
Councillor Sanford.
I just wanted to make one more point on some of the discussion I've heard. We are being asked to participate in a process that brings us into alignment with what we already have. We have an Olympic facility on the doorstep of our community. It's not a fantasy for us to be participating in an Olympic game, because we have a facility that was a legacy from 1988. It's been maintained, it's been upgraded, it's been brought to higher standards to continue to be relevant. And I think that we should be very cognizant of the fact that we have a facility that we also have to keep relevant. And by participating at this level with the BIDCO, we can see what is in it for us in terms of keeping that facility to Olympic caliber and to World Cup standards, and to bring that facility into the 21st century as well. I mean, we have to, it's not something that we're imagining, it's something that's real, and it's one way that we can participate and consider how this can benefit the future as well. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that we are a significant portion of this Olympic bid, and we have the jewel in the crown of Olympic sports in the biathlon and the cross country. And I value that, and I think this community values that. So participating in the BidCo puts us in a situation that could potentially keep that relevant in that world.
Thank you, Councillor. Is there further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried with Councillor McCallum in opposition. And now I'll move that Council nominate the Chief Administrative Officer as the Town of Canmore rep on the BidCo and authorize her to exercise all powers and voting rights associated with the town's membership interest in the BidCo, subject to the CAO for seeking council direction regarding matters that materially affect the legal, business, or financial risk for the town. And I'll speak briefly to the motion. I'll support the motion. I have the utmost confidence in Ms. DeSoto, and I talked with her quite a bit, as council knows, because I work in the same building, and we've talked about the impact to her ability to do the job, the rest of her job, and she feels that she can handle that, and I'm confident that she can. I'm also confident that if she finds there's a significant or even a minor impact to her ability to keep up with her other job requirements, that she'll come to council and identify that fact and suggest some solutions. So when I read through the desired characteristics and directors that came from the Calgary City, it pretty much describes the CAO. I'm not too sure about that first bullet under personal characteristics. Humility, I'm not too sure if I see that. So I'm quite pleased to be able to support appointing Ms. DeSoto to the BidCo. Other discussion on the motion? Councillor McCallum.
In the spirit of the fact that we just passed our governance policy and that one is meant to support the decision of council, I too think that Ms. DeSoto would be very excellent at this job. I don't want to see my vote against this to be a vote against her, but just to be more in principle with my previous vote. But I agree with all the words you just said, Your Worship.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. Well, having worked with Ms. DeSoto for 5 years on council, I think her qualifications are more than adequate, and she will bring the concerns and best intentions of the town of Canmore to that table, and I would highly support her being that person who represents us, because I think she's very cognizant of all the issues that this community faces, and she can go forward with some good advice and good intentions on how Canmore could participate in this BidCo. So I will be happy to support that.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried with Councillor McCallum in opposition. And we have one last item, item G3, 2017 candidate campaign disclosure and financial statement. Ms. Hyde. Wow, that's twice in the same evening for you. That's unusual. Well, can you compress that into one?
I think this report is pretty straightforward. The Local Authorities Election Act requires candidates in election to submit financial disclosure statements if the candidate accepted contributions towards their campaign. if a candidate doesn't accept any contributions before for their campaign, they're exempt from this requirement. As a returning officer, I'm also required to report to you in a public report who did not, actually is what the Act said, submit statements. So there's 3 candidates who did not submit statements. I spoke with each of them, and they told me that they did not accept any contributions. So there is no form for them to fill out. The Act doesn't even require them to report that. So this is my report, and this is what I'm going to do to put it on the record for now. All the disclosure statements are posted to the website under the elections page. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
I have no questions. Does anybody else have questions for Ms. Hyde? And there's a motion.
Motion to accept as information to put it on the record.
Thank you for your report.
Thank you.
I'll then move the council accept the report, 2017 candidate campaign disclosure statements as information. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And I'll move the council be adjourned. Those in favor? Opposed? We're adjourned.